If you're enjoying this video, please consider using your hype points to support it. It helps the channel far more than you might realise, and it means the world to us. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review would be incredibly appreciated as well. We'd also love to know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're tuning in from, but only if you feel like sharing. We genuinely love seeing where everyone is listening, and if you're enjoying the content and haven't already, please consider subscribing. It really does make a difference. Thank you for being here. Before we begin, a huge thank you to Nobasari and Chris for suggesting this story. Your ideas keep this channel going, and we're grateful you're part of this community. Imagine this. The year is 1957. The Cold War is in full swing. Nuclear anxiety hangs over the world like a storm cloud that never breaks. The United States and the Soviet Union are locked in a race that could end in annihilation. In Washington, behind closed doors, military officials are briefing the president on unidentified objects in the sky. The public is told not to worry. Everything is under control, and then a man walks into the Pentagon. He is tall, composed, and dressed in a way that seems almost too neat, too deliberate. His suit is dark, perfectly pressed, with crisp lines that look as though they were measured by a machinist rather than a tailor. His tie is centered exactly. His shoes reflect the fluorescent lights overhead with an almost unnatural sheen. He does not stumble over his words. He does not ask for asylum or citizenship. He does not claim to be a defector or a spy. Instead, he introduces himself with a name that sounds like it came from a science fiction serial playing in theatres across America, Valiant Thor. And then he says something that should have gotten him escorted out immediately, perhaps even detained for psychiatric evaluation. He says he is from Venus. But here is the part that makes the story linger, that makes it impossible to dismiss entirely, no matter how absurd it sounds. He is not dismissed. He is not arrested. He is not laughed out of the building by security personnel or intelligence officers who have heard every conceivable story from every conceivable type of person trying to gain access to classified facilities. According to those who believe the story, he is taken seriously. He is given clearance. He is housed. He is listened to. And for years he allegedly remains in Washington, moving through corridors of power, delivering a message that no one wants to hear, but that everyone seems unable to ignore completely. This is the Valiant Thor conspiracy theory, a story that sounds absurd on the surface, ridiculous even. A story with no hard evidence, no photographs authenticated by independent experts, no official records that have ever been declassified or leaked despite decades of Freedom of Information Act requests. And yet, it has endured for more than half a century. It has been retold in books that have sold thousands of copies. It has been discussed in documentaries that air on cable television at odd hours. It has been debated in forums across the internet by people who have never met but who share a conviction that something happened in Washington during those years, something that was never meant to become public knowledge. The story refuses to die. It adapts. It evolves. It incorporates new details while maintaining its core narrative. And it continues to find new audiences who hear it and think, even if just for a moment, that it might be true. Because the question it asks is simple and deeply unsettling. The kind of question that stays with you long after you've decided whether or not you believe the answer. What if the government didn't just study visitors from other worlds? What if it hosted one? What if for years an extraterrestrial walked the halls of the Pentagon, sat in on classified briefings, spoke with generals and admirals and perhaps even presidents, and then simply left, with the entire episode buried so deeply that it would never surface in any official capacity? What if the silence we hear is not the absence of contact, but the sound of secrecy working exactly as it was designed to work? Chapter 1. America on the Brink. To understand why this story took root, why it found fertile ground in the American consciousness and grew into something that would last for generations, you have to understand the world it was born into. You have to understand what it felt like to live in the late 1950s, when the future was not a promise but a threat. The Second World War had ended barely a decade earlier. The world had seen what modern weapons could do, Cities had been reduced to ash and rubble. Millions had died. And then, in the final days of the war, 2 Japanese cities had been vaporized by a weapon that seemed to belong to a different era of human history entirely, if it belonged to human history at all. The atomic bomb had demonstrated that humanity now possessed the ability to destroy itself completely, and there was no putting that knowledge back in the box. The United States and the Soviet Union had been allies during the war, united against a common enemy. But as soon as that enemy was defeated, the alliance crumbled. Ideological differences that had been set aside in the name of defeating fascism returned with a vengeance. The world split into 2 camps, each convinced that the other represented an existential threat not just to national security, but to civilization itself. And both sides began building weapons. By 1957, both the United States and the Soviet Union had developed thermonuclear weapons, hydrogen bombs that made the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki look like firecrackers by comparison. These were weapons capable of destroying entire metropolitan areas in a single blast. Weapons that could kill millions in seconds. Weapons that, if used in sufficient numbers, could render the planet uninhabitable. The doctrine that governed their use was called mutually assured destruction. The logic was simple and terrifying. If one side launched a nuclear attack, the other side would retaliate before the missiles even landed. Both sides would be annihilated. There would be no winners, only survivors, if there were any at all, stumbling through a radioactive wasteland. This was not a strategy in any conventional sense. It was a bet. A bet that human beings, when faced with the prospect of total annihilation, would choose survival over victory. A bet that fear would prove stronger than pride or ideology, or the countless other factors that had driven nations to war throughout history. And every day that bet held, but only barely. The American public lived with this reality in a way that is difficult to fully appreciate now. Children were taught to hide under their desks in case of a nuclear attack, as if a wooden desk could protect them from a weapon that turned cities into craters. Families were encouraged to build fallout shelters in their basements or backyards, stocking them with canned food and water and supplies that might allow them to survive for a few weeks in the aftermath of an attack. The government distributed pamphlets explaining how to prepare for nuclear war, illustrated with cheerful cartoons that made the apocalypse look manageable. But everyone knew it was a lie. Everyone knew that if the bombs fell, the shelters would not save them, the desks would not protect them, the pamphlets would not matter. There would only be fire and radiation and silence. And in the middle of this, the sky itself seemed to be turning against the public's understanding of reality. UFO sightings were being reported across the country with increasing frequency. Pilots, both civilian and military, were seeing objects that moved in ways no known aircraft could move. They accelerated without visible means of propulsion. They made right-angle turns at speeds that should have torn any conventional craft apart. They disappeared and reappeared in different parts of the sky, as if they were blinking in and out of existence. Radar stations were picking up signals that defied explanation. Objects that appeared on screens, tracked across hundreds of miles, and then vanished without a trace. Objects that moved so fast that the radar operators initially assumed their equipment was malfunctioning, until the sightings kept coming and the patterns became impossible to ignore. The military was investigating, but they were also denying. Publicly, the official line was always the same: weather balloons, temperature inversions, swamp gas, mass hysteria, optical illusions caused by atmospheric conditions. Nothing to see here, nothing to worry about. Go back to your lives and trust that the government has everything under control. But the sightings kept coming, and the denials kept sounding less convincing. Project Blue Book, the Air Force's official investigation into unidentified flying objects, was underway. It had been launched in 1952, building on earlier projects like Sign and Grudge that had quietly examined reports of strange objects in the sky. Publicly, Blue Book was presented as a serious scientific inquiry, a genuine effort to determine whether these sightings represented a threat to national security or could be explained by conventional means. Privately, many believed it was nothing more than a public relations operation, designed to reassure a nervous public while the real findings, whatever they were, remained classified and out of reach. The message from the government was clear. If something was out there, they would handle it. The public did not need to know the details. The public did not need to worry. The public just needed to trust that the men in uniform and the scientists in white coats and the officials in dark suits had everything under control. This was the atmosphere in which the Valiant Thor story emerged. A time when secrecy was not just policy, but a way of life. A time when the government was admitting to almost nothing, even as it was preparing for almost everything. A time when the public was being told that the greatest threat came from the Soviet Union, but when many people could not shake the feeling that there were other threats, other unknowns, that were being deliberately kept from them. Into this world of fear and secrecy and carefully managed information, a man allegedly appeared. A man who should not have existed, who claimed an origin that should have been impossible, who behaved in a way that suggested he expected to be believed, even though everything he said sounded like madness, and what he claimed, if the story is true, changed nothing publicly. The world continued on as it always had. The arms race continued, the fear continued, the secrecy continued, but privately, some say, it changed everything. Chapter 2. The Claim of an Arrival. The story begins with an arrival that should not have been possible, an entrance that violated every protocol and security measure that should have been in place at one of the most secure facilities in the world. According to the conspiracy theory, a man appeared in Washington during the Eisenhower administration. The exact date varies depending on who is telling the story. Some say it was March of 1957, others place it in late 1956 or early 1958. The timeline is deliberately vague in most retellings, which skeptics point to as evidence of fabrication. But believers argue that the vagueness is itself evidence of classification, that the exact date was scrubbed from any records that might have existed. He did not arrive by plane or by car or by any conventional means of transportation. He simply appeared. Some versions of the story say he materialized, inside a secure government building, that one moment a hallway was empty and the next moment he was there, standing calmly as if he had been there all along. Others say he walked through the front entrance of the Pentagon, as if he had every right to be there, as if he possessed credentials that allowed him to bypass security checkpoints that should have stopped anyone who did not belong. The details vary depending on who is telling the story and when they are telling it, and this inconsistency is one of the main reasons skeptics dismiss the entire narrative as fabricated. But the core claim remains the same across all versions, unshaken despite the decades that have passed and the scrutiny that has been applied. He called himself Valiant Thor. The name itself is striking. It does not sound like a real name. It sounds like a character from a science fiction novel or a comic book, the kind of heroic pseudonym that a writer would invent for an alien visitor who comes to Earth with noble intentions. Valiant, meaning brave or courageous. Thor, the name of a Norse god associated with thunder and strength. Together they create an image of power and righteousness, of someone who embodies qualities that humanity aspires to but rarely achieves. He was described as tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that was styled in a way that looked almost too perfect, too uniform, as if each strand had been placed with deliberate care. His face was handsome, in a way that was striking, but also somehow generic, lacking the small imperfections and asymmetries that make human faces unique and memorable. Some who claimed to have seen him said he looked ageless, that it was impossible to tell whether he was 30 or 50 or somewhere in between. He wore a suit that looked perfectly tailored but somehow out of place, as if it had been designed by someone who understood the idea of a suit, who knew that men in positions of authority in mid-20th century America wore dark suits with white shirts and narrow ties, but who did not quite understand the specifics of how humans actually wore them. The fit was too perfect, the fabric too smooth, the lack of wrinkles or creases too complete. He looked like a photograph of a man in a suit rather than an actual man wearing actual clothes. His speech was measured, deliberate, with a cadence that suggested he was choosing each word with care. He did not use contractions. He did not stumble or pause or use the verbal fillers that characterize natural human speech. When he spoke, people listened, not because he raised his voice or demanded attention, but because something in his manner commanded it. His demeanour was calm in a way that went beyond confidence. He did not act like someone who was trying to convince anyone of anything. He did not plead or argue or present evidence to support his claims. He acted like someone who expected to be believed, who assumed that what he was saying would be accepted as truth because truth was self-evident and required no defence, and his claim was extraordinary. He said he was not from Earth. He said he was from Venus, this second planet from the sun, the bright morning star that ancient civilizations had worshipped as a goddess, and that modern astronomers had studied through telescopes but had not yet reached with spacecraft. He said he had come with a message for the leaders of the United States, and that the message was urgent. He said that humanity was at a crossroads, and that the decisions made in the coming years would determine whether civilization survived or destroyed itself. In any rational scenario, this would have been the end of it. Security would have removed him from the building. He would have been questioned, his background investigated, his mental state evaluated. He would have been identified, or, if his identity could not be established, he would have been detained until it could be. He would have been dismissed as a crank, a delusional individual who had somehow managed to bypass security and who needed to be escorted back to whatever institution or situation he had come from. But according to those who believe the story, that is not what happened. Instead, he was taken seriously. He was allegedly escorted to secure facilities within the Pentagon, not as a prisoner, but as a guest. He was given access to high-ranking officials, people whose names would have been recognizable to anyone who followed American politics or military affairs. He was housed, not in a detention center or a psychiatric ward, but in quarters that were comfortable, private, and located within or near the Pentagon itself. And over the course of several years, according to the narrative, he remained in Washington, attending meetings, speaking with military officers and intelligence officials and scientists, providing information and perspective on matters that range from technological development to geopolitical strategy to the nature of human civilization itself. This is where the story stops being just strange and starts being a conspiracy theory. Because if any of this is true, it means that decisions were made at the highest levels of government, decisions about how to respond to this individual, whether to engage with him or dismiss him, whether to keep his presence secret or make it public. And according to the theory, the decision was made to engage, but to do so in complete secrecy. No press conferences, no announcements, no leaks to journalists or briefings to members of Congress who were not part of the inner circle. The entire operation, if it existed, was compartmentalized to such a degree that the vast majority of people working in the Pentagon would have had no idea it was happening. And if the government decided to keep it quiet, the question that has fueled this conspiracy theory for decades becomes unavoidable. Why? What could possibly justify such secrecy? What was so important or so dangerous about this individual's presence that it required a level of classification that has apparently never been breached even after more than half a century? The answer to that question, if there is one, has never been given. But the question itself is enough to keep the story alive. Chapter 3: Frank Strange's and the Testimony. The Valiant Thor story might have remained nothing more than a vague rumour, the kind of story that gets told at UFO conferences and then fades away because there is no substance to it, if not for one man who decided to write it down and present it to the world as fact. His name was Frank Strange's, and he is both the reason the story exists in the form we know it today and the reason so many people dismiss it entirely. Strange's was born in 1920s Brooklyn, the son of Italian immigrants, and grew up in a working-class neighbourhood where faith was important and where the idea of divine intervention in human affairs was not considered strange or unusual. He became a Pentecostal minister, a man who believed in the reality of the spiritual realm, and who saw no contradiction between Christian faith and the possibility of life on other worlds. If God had created the universe, Strange's reasoned, why would Earth be the only planet with life? Why would humanity be the only intelligent species? The Bible spoke of angels and heavenly hosts, of beings from other realms who visited Earth and delivered messages. Why could those beings not come from other planets as well as from heaven? This theological flexibility, this willingness to incorporate ideas that many Christians would have considered heretical, made Strangers a figure of both fascination and controversy within the religious community. He was a compelling speaker, charismatic in the way that successful evangelists often are, able to hold an audience's attention and make them believe that what he was saying was not just true, but urgently important. In the early 1960s, Strangers became interested in UFOs. He attended conferences, read books and magazines devoted to the subject, corresponded with other researchers and witnesses. He believed that the increasing number of sightings represented something real, something that needed to be understood rather than dismissed. And then, according to his own account, something extraordinary happened. In 1967, he published a book titled Stranger at the Pentagon. It was not a long book, fewer than 200 pages, but it made claims that were astonishing. Strangers said that he had met Valiant Thor personally. He said that the meeting had been arranged through a contact in the government, someone who had known about Thor's presence, and who trusted Strangers enough to introduce him. He said that he had been taken to a secure location, that he had spoken with Thor face to face, that he had asked questions and received answers. The book provided descriptions that were detailed enough to sound credible to those who wanted to believe. Strangers described Thor's appearance in vivid terms: the perfect hair, the ageless face, the unusual smoothness of his skin, the way his eyes seemed to look through you rather than at you. He described Thor's voice as calm and melodious, with a slight accent that was not quite identifiable, as if Thor had learned English perfectly, but had learned it from someone who spoke it as a second language. Strangers claimed that Thor was polite, patient, and deeply concerned about the future of humanity. He spoke about the dangers of nuclear weapons with a gravity that suggested he had seen what happened when civilizations reached this level of technological development without the corresponding moral and spiritual maturity to use it wisely. He spoke about the need for humanity to turn away from violence and embrace peace, not as naive idealism, but as practical necessity. He spoke about the interconnectedness of all life in the universe, about the idea that what happened on Earth mattered beyond Earth, that humanity's choices had consequences that rippled outward in ways that humans could not yet perceive. The book included specific details that were meant to establish Thor's non-human origin. Strangers claimed that Thor's physical characteristics were unusual in ways that could not be explained by genetics or medical anomalies. His blood chemistry was different from that of humans, with cellular structures that did not match any known blood type. His heart beat at a rhythm that was different from human norms, not dramatically so, but enough that it would be noticeable to any physician who examined him. And most strikingly, he had no fingerprints. His hands were smooth, without the whorls and ridges that form in the womb and that every human being possesses from birth. These details were specific enough to sound plausible, vague enough that they could not be verified, and strange enough that they captured the imagination of readers who wanted to believe that contact with extraterrestrial life was not just possible, but had already happened. The book became a cornerstone of the Valiant Thor legend. It was reprinted multiple times over the years, each edition adding new forewords or additional chapters or testimonials from people who claimed to have known Thor or to have had their own experiences that confirmed what Strangers was saying. It was cited in UFO documentaries, discussed at conferences, analysed by researchers who were either convinced of its truth or determined to prove it false. But there was a problem, and it was a problem that critics pointed out immediately and repeatedly. Strangers offered no proof, no photographs, despite the fact that cameras were common in the 1960s, and it would have been trivial to take a picture if he had truly met Thor. No official documents, no memos or reports or any kind of paper trail that would indicate the government had engaged with an extraterrestrial. No corroboration from anyone else who claimed to have been present during any of the alleged meetings. The entire story rested on Stranger's word and his word alone. Critics called the book a hoax, and they were not gentle about it. They said Strangers had invented the story to sell books and gain attention within the UFO community. They pointed out inconsistencies in the narrative, places where details changed between different retellings. They noted that Strangers was a minister and an evangelist, someone whose profession required him to be persuasive, someone who knew how to tell a story in a way that moved people emotionally, even if it was not literally true, and they were not entirely wrong to be sceptical. Without evidence, the story was nothing more than a claim. An interesting claim, certainly, one that captured the imagination and raised profound questions about government secrecy and the possibility of extraterrestrial contact, but a claim nonetheless, unsubstantiated and unverifiable. But for believers, the lack of evidence was not a problem, it was confirmation. Because if the government had hosted an extraterrestrial, if such an event had occurred, it would have been classified at the highest possible level. There would be no photographs released to the public because the photographs themselves would be classified. There would be no documents because the documents would be locked away in vaults or destroyed entirely to prevent any possibility of disclosure. There would be no corroboration because everyone who had been present would have been sworn to secrecy under penalty of imprisonment or worse. The absence of proof in this framework was not evidence that the story was false. It was evidence that the cover-up was working exactly as it was designed to work. It was evidence that the government was capable of keeping secrets, which was not exactly a controversial claim given the number of classified programs that had been revealed over the years, often decades after they had been operational. And in the world of conspiracy theories, that logic is often enough to sustain a narrative indefinitely. Because once you accept that the government is capable of hiding the truth, then the absence of evidence becomes meaningless. Anything can be true, as long as you can construct a plausible reason why there would be no proof. Frank Strangers died in 2013, taking whatever truth or fiction he knew with him to the grave. But the book he wrote outlasted him. It continues to circulate, continues to find new readers, continues to serve as the primary source for anyone who wants to learn about Valiant Thor. And the question remains, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable. Was Frank Strangers a witness to something extraordinary? Or was he simply a gifted storyteller who understood that the most compelling lies are the ones that contain just enough detail to sound real? Chapter 4. The Pentagon Connection. One of the most persistent and troubling elements of the Valiant Thor story is the claim that he was housed near or within the Pentagon itself, one of the most secure facilities in the world. The Pentagon is not just a building, it is a symbol. It is the headquarters of the United States Department of Defense, the nerve center of American military power, the place where strategy is developed and decisions are made that affect the lives of millions of people around the world. It is a massive structure, one of the largest office buildings ever constructed, with 5 concentric rings connected by corridors that stretch for miles. More than 20,000 people work there on any given day, military personnel and civilian employees and contractors, all engaged in the vast bureaucratic machinery of national defense. Security at the Pentagon is not casual. Access is restricted and carefully controlled. Everyone who enters must have authorization. Everyone who works there is vetted. Everyone who moves through its corridors is tracked, at least in theory. The building houses classified information that, if disclosed, could compromise military operations, endanger intelligence assets, or reveal capabilities that adversaries are not supposed to know exist. The idea that an extraterrestrial could have lived there for years without anyone noticing, without the wrong person asking the wrong question, without a journalist or a congressman or a curious employee stumbling onto something that should not have been there, stretches credibility to the breaking point and beyond. And yet, that is exactly what the theory claims. According to the story, Valiant Thor was given quarters in a secure section of the Pentagon, a location that is never specified in any detail, but that is described as being accessible only to those with the highest levels of clearance. He was provided with accommodations that were comfortable and private. He was given clothing that allowed him to blend in, or at least to avoid standing out in a way that would attract unwanted attention. He was granted clearance that allowed him to move through the building without restriction, to attend meetings, to access information, to speak with officials who ranged from mid-level analysts to senior military leadership. The theory does not claim that everyone in the Pentagon knew about him. That would have been impossible to maintain. Too many people, too many opportunities for someone to talk or to leak information, or to simply ask a question that would unravel the entire operation. Instead, the theory claims that access to Thor was restricted to a small group of officials with the highest levels of clearance, people who had been read into the program and who understood that disclosure was not an option. Compartmentalization is a standard practice in classified operations. Information is shared only on a need-to-know basis. Different teams work on different aspects of a project without knowing what the other teams are doing. Entire programs can operate within the Pentagon without the majority of the building's occupants having any idea they exist. If Thor's presence was compartmentalized in this way, classified under a program name that revealed nothing about its actual nature, then most people working in the Pentagon would never have heard his name or had any reason to suspect that anything unusual was happening. But even granting that level of secrecy, the logistics are staggering. Where did he sleep? What did he eat? How did he move through the building without attracting attention? How did he communicate with the outside world, if he did at all? How were meetings arranged? How was his presence explained to the people who did see him? The secretaries and assistants and guards who would have encountered him in hallways or waiting rooms? The theory does not provide satisfying answers to these questions, which is one reason skeptics find it so easy to dismiss. But believers argue that the lack of answers is precisely what you would expect if the operation had been conducted properly. The whole point of compartmentalization and classification is to ensure that the answers to those questions are never known outside of a very small circle. But the larger question remains, why would the government do this? Why would they take the risk of housing an individual whose presence, if discovered, would have caused a scandal that would have made Watergate look trivial by comparison? Why would they engage with someone making extraordinary claims rather than simply dismissing him as delusional? One explanation offered by believers is pragmatic, even coldly logical. If an individual appeared claiming to be from another world, and if there was even the slightest possibility that the claim was true, refusing to engage would have been foolish and potentially catastrophic. The United States was locked in an existential struggle with the Soviet Union. Any advantage, any source of information or technology or strategic insight could have tipped the balance. If Thor was telling the truth, if he possessed knowledge that could help the United States prevail in the Cold War or avoid a nuclear catastrophe, then dismissing him out of hand would have been a dereliction of duty. Even if his claims seemed impossible, the risk of being wrong was too great. Better to engage, to question, to probe and test and verify, than to turn away and later discover that an opportunity had been missed. This is the logic of intelligence work, the logic that says you investigate every lead, no matter how unlikely, because the cost of missing something important is always greater than the cost of wasting time on something that turns out to be nothing. Another explanation is darker and more cynical. If Thor's presence was real, it would have been a matter of national security in the most fundamental sense. Admitting that an extraterrestrial was in Washington would have caused panic. It would have raised questions the government could not answer. It would have destabilized public trust at a time when trust was already fragile, and when the government needed the public to remain calm and to believe that their leaders were in control. The decision to keep it quiet would not have been about protecting Thor or respecting his wishes, or honouring any kind of diplomatic relationship with whatever civilization he represented. It would have been about protecting the stability of American society and the credibility of American institutions. It would have been about ensuring that the public did not learn something that would shatter their understanding of reality and that might lead to social chaos or political upheaval. And if that decision was made, if the calculation was that secrecy was necessary to preserve order, then it would explain why there are no records, why there are no photographs, why there is no official acknowledgement, because the entire point would have been to ensure that no one outside of a very small group ever found out. The Pentagon connection is the element of the Valiant Thor story that makes it feel, at least to some people, like it could be true. Not because there is evidence for it, but because the logic of secrecy and compartmentalization is real. The government does keep secrets. It has kept secrets that were far less extraordinary than an extraterrestrial visitor, and that were maintained for decades before being revealed. The machinery of classification exists, and it works. And if it can work to hide weapons programs and surveillance operations and covert actions in foreign countries, why couldn't it work to hide this? Chapter 5. The Eisenhower Angle. Dwight David Eisenhower is a central figure in many UFO conspiracy theories, and the Valiant Thor story is no exception. His presidency coincided with a period of intense UFO activity, a time when sightings were being reported with increasing frequency, and when the military was taking the phenomenon seriously enough to devote resources to investigating it. And Eisenhower himself, according to declassified documents and public statements, was aware of these investigations and received briefings on their findings. Eisenhower was not a man prone to flights of fancy. He was a career military officer who had risen to the rank of 5-star general, who had served as Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force in Europe during the Second World War, who had planned and executed the D-Day invasion that turned the tide of the war against Nazi Germany. He was a strategist, a pragmatist, someone who dealt in facts and logistics, and who understood that success depended on careful planning and accurate information. He was also someone who understood the importance of secrecy. During his presidency, he oversaw the expansion of the intelligence community, the development of spy satellites and reconnaissance aircraft, the establishment of programs that would remain classified for decades. He understood that there were things the public did not need to know, things that would be better kept secret for reasons of national security or international diplomacy or simple practicality. In his farewell address in 1961, as he was preparing to leave office, Eisenhower delivered a warning that has resonated ever since. He spoke about the military-industrial complex, the growing alliance between the armed forces and the defence contractors who built their weapons and equipment. He warned that this alliance had the potential to exert undue influence on government policy, that it could lead to decisions being made for the benefit of those who profited from war, rather than for the benefit of the nation as a whole. Conspiracy theorists have interpreted this warning in various ways. Some see it as evidence that Eisenhower had become aware of secret programs that troubled him, programs that he could not speak about directly, but that he felt compelled to warn the public about in the most oblique way possible. Others see it as a broader statement about the dangers of allowing any single interest group to gain too much power over government decision-making. In the context of the Valiant Thor story, Eisenhower's warning takes on additional significance, because if Thor was real, if he was in Washington during Eisenhower's presidency, then Eisenhower would almost certainly have known about him. He would have been briefed. He might even have met with Thor personally. And if Thor's message was about the dangers of nuclear weapons and the need for moral development to match technological advancement, then Eisenhower's farewell address could be seen as an echo of that message, a way of passing along Thor's warning without ever acknowledging its source. The theory claims that Thor requested a meeting with the president. Some versions say the meeting happened, that Eisenhower sat down with Thor in a secure location and listened to what he had to say. Others say the meeting was denied, that Eisenhower's advisors convinced him that such a meeting would be too risky, that it would set a precedent that could not be maintained, that it would be better to keep Thor at arm's length and to limit his access to lower-level officials who could gather information without exposing the president himself to direct contact. But whether or not a meeting happened, the theory suggests that Eisenhower was aware of Thor's presence and that he took the message seriously. The challenge, according to believers, was that acting on the message would have required doing things that were politically impossible, dismantling the nuclear arsenal, pursuing disarmament agreements with the Soviet Union that Stalin's successors would never have accepted, taking steps that would have been seen as weakness, as capitulation, as a betrayal of American strength and resolve. And so, the theory goes, Eisenhower did nothing, or at least he did nothing visible. He maintained the nuclear deterrent. He continued the arms race. He pursued policies that kept the United States strong and competitive and ready to respond to any Soviet aggression. But privately, perhaps, he understood that Thor was right, that the path humanity was on led to disaster, and that there was no way to change course without risking immediate disaster of a different kind. The problem with all of this, of course, is that there is no documentation, no memos, no diary entries, no recordings. Eisenhower kept meticulous records of his presidency, and those records have been studied exhaustively by historians. Nothing in them mentions Valiant Thor or anything resembling the story that has been told about him. But for conspiracy theorists, this is not proof of absence, it is proof of classification. If a meeting between Eisenhower and Thor had occurred, it would have been off the books. The president's official schedule would have been adjusted to show him engaged in something mundane. The actual meeting would have been arranged through back channels, attended only by those with the highest clearances, recorded in documents that were classified so deeply that they might never be declassified. The absence of records, once again, becomes evidence, because if the secret was kept successfully, then there would be no records to find. The only way to prove the story false would be to have complete access to every classified document from the Eisenhower administration, and such access has never been granted and likely never will be. And so the Eisenhower angle remains part of the Valiant Thor story, unproven, unprovable, but persistent, because it fits the larger narrative of secrecy and missed opportunities and warnings that were heard but not heeded. Chapter 6. The Biological Oddities. One of the most compelling aspects of the Valiant Thor story, at least for those who believe it, is the claim that his biology was fundamentally different from that of humans in ways that were subtle but unmistakable to anyone who examined him closely. According to Frank Strangers and others who have elaborated on the story over the years, Thor looked human. He could walk down a street in Washington, and no one would give him a second glance. He did not have green skin or antennae, or any of the dramatic physical features that science fiction had taught people to associate with aliens. From a distance, he was indistinguishable from any other well-dressed man in the nation's capital. But upon closer examination there were anomalies, small things that would only be noticed by someone who was looking carefully, someone with medical training or scientific curiosity or both. His blood chemistry was reportedly unlike anything doctors had seen. The exact details vary depending on the source and the telling, but the core claim is consistent. Thor's blood did not match any known human blood type. It was not A or B or AB or O. It was something else entirely, with cellular structures that did not conform to the patterns that medical science had documented in millions of human blood samples. Some versions of the story claim that his blood cells were shaped differently, that they were more efficient at carrying oxygen, or that they contained elements that were not present in human blood. Others suggest that his blood had properties that allowed it to resist disease or radiation in ways that human blood could not. Still others leave the details deliberately vague, saying only that tests were conducted and that the results were anomalous enough to convince the doctors who examined him that they were not dealing with a normal human being. His heart was said to beat at a different rhythm, not dramatically faster or slower than a human heart, but different in a way that was subtle and difficult to describe. Some accounts say his heart had a different structure, additional chambers or valves that changed the pattern of blood flow. Others say the rhythm itself was irregular in a way that would have been pathological in a human, but that seemed perfectly healthy in Thor. And then there is the most frequently cited detail, the claim that Thor had no fingerprints. Fingerprints are one of the most fundamental and universal human characteristics. They form during fetal development, created by the interaction between the growing skin and the amniotic fluid in the womb. The patterns are unique to each individual, so unique that they have been used for identification purposes for more than a century. Every human being has them. Criminals have tried to remove them through burning or chemical treatment, but the patterns grow back. They are a feature of being human. Except, according to the story, Thor did not have them. His hands were smooth, without the whorls and loops and ridges that cover human fingertips. This detail has become one of the most iconic elements of the Valiant Thor legend, repeated in nearly every retelling of the story, cited as one of the primary pieces of evidence that Thor was not human. The problem, as with every other aspect of the story, is that these claims are impossible to verify. There are no medical records, no blood samples preserved in a laboratory somewhere, no photographs of Thor's hands that clearly show the absence of fingerprints, no testimony from doctors or scientists who can confirm that they examined him and found these anomalies. The entire basis for these assertions comes from anecdotal testimony, primarily from Frank Strangers, who claimed to have been told these details by government officials, or to have observed them himself during his alleged meeting with Thor. And Strangers, whatever his intentions or motivations, was not a medical professional. He had no formal training in biology or anatomy. He was a minister and a UFO enthusiast, someone whose interest in Thor was spiritual and philosophical rather than scientific. Skeptics point out that the claims about Thor's biology are oddly specific for something that cannot be proven. If his blood was so unusual, why were no samples taken for independent analysis? If his heart beat differently, why were no cardiograms made? If he had no fingerprints, why was no attempt made to document this through photography or forensic analysis? The lack of evidence is glaring, and in any other context it would be sufficient to dismiss the claims entirely. But believers respond with the same argument they always do. If Thor's biology had been studied, the results would have been classified. They would have been locked away in secure facilities, accessible only to those with the proper clearances. They would never have been released to the public because releasing them would have confirmed that the government had engaged with a non-human entity, and such a confirmation would have raised questions that the government was not prepared to answer. The absence of documentation in this framework is not evidence that the claims are false. It is evidence that the information is being withheld. It is evidence that the cover-up extends not just to Thor's presence, but to every detail about him, including the scientific and medical data that would prove he was not human. And so, the biological oddities remain part of the story, unverified, unverifiable, but persistent, because they provide the story with a foundation of specificity that makes it feel more real than it would if Thor were simply described as looking and acting human in every way. The details, strange as they are, give the story texture. They make it feel like something that could have happened, even if there is no proof that it did. Chapter 7. The Message. If the Valiant Thor story is true, if any part of it reflects actual events rather than fabrication or delusion, then the most important element is not his arrival, or his biology, or his alleged meetings with government officials. The most important element is the message he came to deliver, because according to the narrative, Thor did not come to Earth as a tourist or an observer. He came with a purpose. He came to warn humanity about the path it was on, and to offer an alternative before it was too late. The core of his message, as it has been recounted in various sources over the decades, was simple and stark. Humanity had to abandon nuclear weapons. The development of nuclear technology represented a threshold moment in human history. For the first time, a species had created weapons capable of destroying not just armies or cities, but entire civilizations, perhaps even rendering the planet uninhabitable for any complex life. This was not an incremental advancement. This was not a more powerful version of something that had come before. This was something new, something that changed the rules of existence in a fundamental way. Thor's message, as described by those who claim to have heard it, or to have been told about it, was that technological advancement without corresponding moral and spiritual development was a recipe for disaster. Humanity had gained the ability to destroy itself before it had gained the wisdom to choose not to. And history, according to Thor, was full of examples of civilizations that had reached this same crossroads and had made the wrong choice. He was not speaking theoretically. He was speaking from experience, or at least from knowledge of what had happened to others. Civilizations that had developed weapons of mass destruction had either learned to control them or had used them and ceased to exist. There was no middle ground, no third option. Either humanity would step back from the brink, or it would fall over the edge. The message resonated deeply with the anxieties of the time. The Cold War was not an abstract political conflict. It was a very real and present danger that hung over every aspect of life in the 1950s and 60s. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which occurred in 1962, brought the world closer to nuclear war than it had ever been. For 13 days, American and Soviet leaders engaged in a tense standoff that could have ended in catastrophe. Missiles were armed, bombers were in the air, submarine commanders were given authorization to use nuclear weapons if they lost contact with their superiors. The world came within a hair's breadth of annihilation, and then, at the last possible moment, both sides backed down. Agreements were reached, the missiles were withdrawn, the crisis passed, but the fear remained, because everyone understood that it could happen again, that the next crisis might not end peacefully, that somewhere, somehow, a decision would be made, or an accident would occur that would trigger the sequence of events that would end civilization. Thor's message, if it was real, spoke directly to that fear. He was saying what many people were thinking but could not articulate or did not dare to say publicly, that the weapons were too dangerous to exist, that the logic of mutually assured destruction was insane, that betting the survival of the species on the assumption that no one would ever make a mistake was not a strategy but a gamble, and that eventually every gamble fails. But the message went beyond just nuclear weapons. According to those who have elaborated on Thor's teachings, he spoke about the need for humanity to mature as a species, to move beyond nationalism and tribalism and the countless divisions that set human beings against each other, to recognise that everyone on Earth shared a common fate, and that cooperation was not weakness but necessity. He spoke about the dangers of materialism, the valuing technological progress and economic growth above all else. He spoke about the need for spiritual development, for cultivating wisdom and compassion, and the kinds of qualities that prevent people from using power destructively. He spoke about the interconnectedness of all life, the idea that what happened on Earth mattered. Beyond Earth, that humanity's choices had consequences that rippled outward through the cosmos in ways that humans could not yet perceive but that were nonetheless real. This was not the message of a conqueror or a colonizer. This was not a threat or an ultimatum. Thor was not saying that if humanity did not change, some external force would intervene to make it change. He was saying that if humanity did not change, it would destroy itself, and that such a destruction would be a tragedy not just for humans but for the universe as a whole. The message was delivered with urgency but also with a kind of sadness, as if Thor understood that he was speaking to people who were not ready to hear what he was saying, as if he knew that no matter how clearly he articulated the danger, no matter how persuasively he argued for an alternative path, the weight of history and politics and human nature would make it nearly impossible for his warning to be heeded. And according to the story, he was, right? The government officials who allegedly met with Thor listened, they asked questions, they engaged with his arguments, they may have even been convinced on some level that he was telling the truth, but they did not act. They did not dismantle the nuclear arsenals. They did not pursue the kind of radical disarmament that Thor was advocating. They did not change course. The reasons for this inaction, according to the theory, were practical and political. Disarming unilaterally would have left the United States vulnerable to Soviet aggression. The Soviet Union, for its part, would never have agreed to disarm as long as it believed the United States was a threat. The balance of power depended on the threat of retaliation. To give up that threat would have been to invite defeat, and no leader could justify such a decision to their people or to history. And so Thor's message, if it was ever delivered, was acknowledged and then set aside, filed away in some classified archive, perhaps, or simply forgotten as officials moved on to more immediate concerns. The warning was heard, but it was not heeded. Some versions of the story claim that Thor grew frustrated as the years passed, that he saw the futility of his mission, that he realized humanity was not ready to change, that the political and social structures that governed human behavior were too rigid, too invested in the status quo to allow for the kind of transformation he was advocating. Other versions claim that he remained hopeful, that he believed the seeds he had planted might grow over time, that future generations might hear his message and act on it in ways that the leaders of the 1950s and 60s could not. But in the end, according to the story, he left, and the world continued on the path he had warned against. The arms race continued, the weapons multiplied, the danger grew, and decades later, the weapons are still here, the danger is still real, and the question Thor allegedly asked remains unanswered. Chapter 8. The problem with Venus. One of the most significant and often cited challenges to the Valiant Thor story is the claim that he was from Venus, the second planet from the Sun. In the 1950s, Venus was still something of a mystery wrapped in clouds. Telescopes could observe its thick, impenetrable atmosphere, but what lay beneath was a matter of speculation and imagination. Some scientists theorized that Venus might have oceans, that beneath the clouds might be a world of water and possibly life. Others suggested jungles, lush and tropical, a planet where life had evolved in ways similar to Earth, but perhaps at an earlier stage of development. Still, others imagined deserts, harsh and inhospitable, but not necessarily devoid of life. Science fiction writers of the era often set stories on Venus, depicting it as a world of swamps and dinosaurs, a prehistoric landscape where adventure awaited. The clouds made it easy to project whatever vision seemed most compelling. Without concrete data, any scenario was possible, but then the space age began, and the data started coming in. And what the data revealed shattered any romantic notions about Venus being a place where life, as humans understood it, could exist. The first Soviet Venera probes, launched in the 1960s, sent back information that was shocking in its hostility. The surface temperature of Venus was not just hot. It was hundreds of degrees, hot enough to melt lead. The atmospheric pressure at the surface was crushing, nearly 100 times that of Earth at sea level, equivalent to being a kilometre underwater in Earth's oceans. The atmosphere itself was composed primarily of carbon dioxide, with clouds of sulfuric acid that would dissolve any unprotected material in minutes. Later missions confirmed and expanded on these findings. Venus was not a world of oceans or jungles. It was a hellscape, a planet where the greenhouse effect had run wild, trapping heat until the surface became an inferno. There was no water, no breathable air, no magnetic field to protect against radiation. It was, in every measurable way, one of the most hostile environments in the solar system. For skeptics, this was the death blow to the Valiant Thor story. If Thor claimed to be from Venus, and Venus was demonstrably uninhabitable, then Thor was either lying or delusional or both. The entire story collapsed under the weight of observable, verifiable reality. Spacecraft had been there. They had measured the conditions. There was no ambiguity. Venus could not support life. And yet conspiracy theorists did not abandon the story. They adapted it. One common response is to argue that Thor deliberately simplified or obscured his true origin. That he said Venus because it was a name humans would recognise, a celestial object that was familiar and that seemed plausible at the time, but that he was actually from somewhere else, perhaps a moon of one of the outer planets, perhaps a planet in another star system entirely, perhaps a parallel dimension or an alternate reality where Venus existed in a different state. This explanation allows believers to preserve the core narrative while acknowledging that the Venus claim is problematic. It reframes Thor not as a liar, but as someone who was communicating in a way that humans of the time could understand, even if that meant simplifying or altering details that would have been too complex or too confusing to explain. Another response is to suggest that Venus was once habitable, that Thor's people had lived there in the distant past before the planet underwent the catastrophic transformation that turned it into the hellscape it is today. In this version, Thor and his people are survivors or descendants of a civilization that fled Venus before conditions became unlivable, and they continue to identify with Venus even though they no longer live there. This explanation requires accepting a timeline that extends back millions or even billions of years, and it raises questions about where Thor's people went after leaving Venus and how they survived in the interim. But it has a certain appeal because it incorporates real planetary science. Venus did likely have a different climate in the distant past, possibly even liquid water on its surface before the runaway greenhouse effect took hold. Whether it ever had life is unknown, but the possibility is not ruled out by current scientific understanding. A third response, more extreme and less widely accepted even among believers, is to claim that the data from the space probes is itself part of a cover-up, that the real conditions on Venus are being hidden or misrepresented to discredit stories like Thor's, that space agencies around the world, including those of rival nations that were competing fiercely during the Cold War, have nonetheless conspired to falsify data about Venus to maintain the secrecy around extraterrestrial contact. This argument requires believing in a level of coordination and deception that is difficult to defend. It means that Soviet scientists and American scientists, who were racing to outdo each other in the space race, and who had every incentive to expose any falsification by the other side, somehow agreed to present the same false picture of Venus. It means that every subsequent mission to Venus, launched by multiple countries over multiple decades, has maintained the same deception. It is a conspiracy theory built on top of a conspiracy theory, layers of secrecy and collusion that become less plausible with each additional layer. The Venus problem remains one of the biggest obstacles to accepting the Valiant Thor story as literal truth. It is a concrete, verifiable contradiction that cannot be easily explained away. But for believers, it is not insurmountable, because the story at its core is not really about Venus. It is about what Thor represented. He represented the idea that humanity was being watched, that the choices being made on Earth mattered to someone beyond Earth, that there were consequences to the path humanity was on, and that those consequences extended beyond the purely terrestrial. Whether he actually came from Venus, or from somewhere else, or from nowhere at all is, in a sense, beside the point. What matters is the message, and the message does not depend on the accuracy of a single detail about planetary science. It depends on whether the warning resonates, whether it speaks to something real and urgent, whether it articulates a fear or a hope that people recognize as true even if the story itself cannot be proven. And on that level, the Venus problem is a distraction, an obstacle for skeptics to point to, certainly, but not enough to kill the story, because stories like this survive not because every detail is accurate, but because they touch something deeper than facts. Chapter 9. The Quiet Disappearance. Every story needs an ending, and the Valiant Thor story has one, but it is not the kind of ending that provides resolution or clarity, or even a sense that the narrative has reached its natural conclusion. It is an ending that feels more like a door closing quietly in the night, leaving behind only questions and silence. According to the narrative, Valiant Thor remained in Washington for several years. The exact length of time varies depending on which version of the story you read or who is telling it. Frank Strange's claimed it was 3 years. Other sources suggest it might have been longer, perhaps as many as 5 years or more. The timeline is deliberately vague, which skeptics cite as evidence of fabrication, but which believers interpret as another sign of classification, of details being obscured to protect the operation. During his time in Washington, Thor allegedly continued to meet with officials, to provide information and perspective to articulate his warnings about the dangers facing humanity, but at some point it became clear that his mission was not succeeding. The warnings were being heard, but they were not being acted upon. The government was not going to dismantle its nuclear arsenal. It was not going to pursue the kind of radical change in policy that Thor was advocating. The political realities were too constraining, the geopolitical stakes too high, the momentum of history too strong to be altered by the words of one individual, no matter how compelling his arguments or how extraordinary his claimed origin. And so, according to the story, Thor left. There was no announcement, no farewell address, no press conference or public statement explaining where he had been or what he had said or why he was leaving. No dramatic departure witnessed by crowds or documented by cameras. He simply left. One day he was there, and the next day he was gone. Some versions of the story claim that Thor returned to a spacecraft that had been hidden somewhere in the vicinity of Washington, perhaps in a remote location in Virginia or Maryland, far from population centres and prying eyes. That he boarded the craft and departed Earth, returning to wherever he had come from, his mission complete or at least concluded, whether or not it had achieved its objectives. Other versions suggest that he departed through means that were never explained, and that could not be explained using human understanding of physics or transportation. That he simply vanished, returning to his point of origin through processes that transcended the limitations of space and time as humans experienced them. Still other versions leave the details of his departure deliberately vague, providing no explanation at all. He was there, and then he was not. How he left and where he went are questions that are never answered. mysteries that are layered on top of the existing mystery of who he was and why he came. What is consistent across all versions of the story is that there was no follow-up. Thor did not return. There were no additional visits, no further messages, no ongoing communication between him and the government officials he had allegedly met with. No indication that his presence had changed anything in any measurable way. The world continued on as it always had. The arms race continued. The Cold War continued. The fear of nuclear annihilation continued. Whatever impact Thor might have had, if any, was invisible to the outside world, and perhaps invisible even to those who had met him. The lack of follow-up is one of the elements of the story that skeptics find most damning. If Thor had been real, if contact had been made, why would it end so abruptly? Why would there be no ongoing relationship, no continued dialogue, no attempt to maintain the connection that had been established? The silence that followed Thor's alleged departure suggests that nothing happened at all, that the entire story is fabrication from beginning to end. But believers interpret the silence differently. They see it as evidence that Thor recognized the futility of his mission, that he understood, after years of engagement, that humanity was not ready to change, that the political and social structures that governed human behavior were too rigid, too invested in maintaining the status quo to allow for the kind of transformation he was advocating. He had delivered his message. He had been heard, even if he had not been heeded. And there was nothing more he could do. Some versions of the story suggest that Thor was not acting alone, that he was part of a larger group or civilization that had been monitoring Earth, and that his mission was one of many such missions conducted over the years. In this interpretation, his departure was not a rejection of humanity, but a recognition that each civilization must find its own path, must make its own choices, and that interference beyond a certain point would be counterproductive or even harmful. The story ends as abruptly as it begins, without resolution or closure, and that in many ways is part of its power, because the lack of an ending leaves space for interpretation. It allows believers to imagine what might have happened after Thor left, to speculate about whether he might return someday, whether his warning might eventually be heeded, whether future generations might succeed, whether leaders of the 1950s and 60s failed. It allows skeptics to dismiss the entire thing as fiction, as a story that was never meant to be taken literally, but that captured the imagination because it articulated fears and hopes that were real, even if the narrative itself was not. And it ensures that the story can never be fully disproven, because there is no concrete endpoint to challenge. The story exists in a state of perpetual possibility, never confirmed but never entirely refuted, lingering in the space between belief and skepticism, where conspiracy theories thrive. The quiet disappearance is not an ending. It is a pause, a moment of silence that invites questions rather than answering them. And in that silence, the story continues to live. Chapter 10. Why the story never died. More than 6 decades have passed since the events described in the Valiant Thor story allegedly occurred. Generations have come and gone. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The world has changed in ways that would have been unimaginable to the people living through the 1950s and 60s. And yet, the story has not faded. It has not been forgotten or relegated to the dustbin of discredited conspiracy theories. It continues to circulate, continues to find new audiences, continues to provoke discussion and debate. Why? What is it about this particular story, this particular conspiracy theory, that gives it such longevity? Part of the answer lies in the nature of the story itself. It is not about invasion or conquest. It is not about abduction or experimentation or the kinds of hostile encounters that characterize so many other UFO narratives. It is about contact, peaceful, deliberate, purposeful contact, and not just contact, but contact that was acknowledged and engaged with, at least according to the story, by the highest levels of government. That is a narrative that resonates, because it suggests that humanity is not alone, but also that the beings who are watching us are not hostile. They are concerned. They care enough to warn us. They see value in human civilization, value worth preserving, even if humans themselves seem determined to destroy what they have built. The Valiant Thor story fits neatly into the framework of Cold War secrecy. It emerged at a time when everyone knew the government was hiding things. That much was undeniable. Nuclear tests were conducted in secret locations, with observers sworn to secrecy and with results that were classified for years or decades. Surveillance programs operated without public knowledge or oversight. Covert operations were carried out in foreign countries, with the American public told nothing about what was being done in their name. The public was told that everything was under control, that the government was acting in their best interests, that the secrecy was necessary for national security. And to some extent the public accepted this, but it also bred mistrust. Because if the government was willing to hide so much, what else might they be hiding? If they could keep nuclear tests and spy programs secret for years, why not contact with an extraterrestrial? In that context, the Valiant Thor story does not seem absurd. It seems plausible, not proven certainly, not supported by evidence, but plausible in the sense that it fits the pattern of secrecy that everyone knew existed. It is one more secret in a world full of secrets, one more thing that might be true even if there is no way to verify it. The story also survives because it casts extraterrestrials in a sympathetic light. Thor is not a threat. He is not a conqueror or an invader. He is not conducting experiments on humans or abducting people from their homes. He is a messenger. Someone who came to help, someone who offered wisdom and guidance, only to be turned away or ignored. That is a narrative that appeals to people who want to believe that we are not alone, but who also want to believe that whatever is out there is benevolent, that the universe is not fundamentally hostile, that intelligence and compassion go hand in hand. And then there is the message itself, the warning about nuclear weapons, the call for moral development to match technological advancement, the emphasis on cooperation and unity, and the dangers of tribalism and nationalism. These are not fringe ideas. They are concerns that were widely shared during the Cold War, and that remain relevant today. Embedding these concerns in the voice of an extraterrestrial gives them weight. It makes them feel urgent and important. It suggests that these are not just human worries, but universal truths, principles that apply to any civilization that reaches a certain level of technological development. Finally, the story persists because it cannot be fully disproven. There are no records to refute, no documents that categorically state that the events described never happened, no bodies to examine, no physical evidence to analyse. The absence of evidence is treated as evidence of a cover-up, and that makes the theory immune to conventional debunking. Because once you accept that the government is capable of keeping secrets, and there is ample historical evidence that it is, then the absence of evidence becomes meaningless. Anything can be true as long as you can construct a plausible reason why there would be no proof. This is the paradox at the heart of all conspiracy theories. They survive not despite the lack of evidence, but because of it. Because the lack of evidence is incorporated into the theory itself, explained away as part of the cover-up, used as confirmation that the conspiracy is real and effective. The Valiant Thor story is, in many ways, a perfect conspiracy theory. It is specific enough to feel real, vague enough to be unfalsifiable, and resonant enough to touch on genuine fears and hopes. It offers a narrative that is both disturbing and comforting, a story about warnings that were delivered but not heeded, about opportunities that were missed, about a world that could have been different if only the right choices had been made. In the end, the story is less about whether it is true and more about what it represents. It represents the fear that we are not ready for the power we have been given. It represents the hope that someone somewhere cares enough to warn us. And it represents the frustration that even if such a warning were delivered, it would be ignored, filed away, forgotten in the rush of daily concerns and political calculations and the endless cycle of crises that demand immediate attention at the expense of long-term thinking. The story never died because it speaks to something that has never died. The sense that humanity is on trial, that the choices we make matter, that the path we're on is not inevitable. Whether Valiant Thor was real or not is almost beside the point, because the questions he allegedly raised are real, and they are still unanswered. epilogue, stranger or symbol. So what do we make of Valiant Thor? Was he a literal visitor from another world? A being who walked the halls of the Pentagon and delivered warnings that were heard but not heeded? Or was he a myth, a story born from Cold War anxiety and perpetuated by people who wanted to believe in something larger than themselves? The truth, if there is one, may never be known. And perhaps that is fitting. There is no evidence that Valiant Thor existed. No photographs that have been authenticated by independent experts. No documents that have been declassified or leaked despite decades of Freedom of Information Act requests and investigative journalism. No credible witnesses beyond frank strangers, whose testimony has never been corroborated by anyone else who was allegedly present during the events he described. Every claim in the story is either unverifiable or contradicted by known facts. The planet he claimed to be from is hostile to life as we understand it. The government he allegedly met with has never acknowledged his existence. The people who claim to have met him are either dead or have remained silent. From a purely rational, evidence-based standpoint, the story does not hold up. It is almost certainly a myth. But myths have power, and the power of the Valiant Thor story is not in whether it happened. It is in what it reveals about the people who tell it and the people who believe it. It reveals a deep mistrust of authority, a belief that the truth is being hidden from the public for reasons that may be justified or may be sinister. It reveals a sense that the world is more complex and more dangerous than we are being told, that there are layers of reality that exist beyond what we can see and measure and document. It reveals a longing for guidance, for wisdom, for someone to step in and offer a solution to problems that feel insurmountable. And it reveals something else, something perhaps more profound. A recognition that we are, in some sense, on trial, that the choices we make matter, that the path we are on is not inevitable, that alternatives exist, that change is possible if we are willing to pursue it, that if we are being watched, if someone is paying attention, we should act as though we are worthy of being watched. Whether Valiant Thor was a literal visitor, a Cold War hoax, or a symbolic warning disguised as a story is almost beside the point. Because the story endures not because of what it proves, but because of what it asks. It asks whether we are ready to listen, whether we are capable of change, whether we can set aside pride and fear and self-interest long enough to do what is necessary, even when what is necessary is difficult or uncomfortable or politically impossible. And it asks whether, if someone came to warn us, we would even hear them, or whether we would do exactly what the story says we did. Listen politely, nod in acknowledgement, file the warning away, and then go right back to what we were doing, trusting that somehow, despite all evidence to the contrary, everything will work out in the end. That is the real conspiracy. Not that an extraterrestrial came to Earth in the 1950s, but that if one did, we would do exactly what the story describes. We would be incapable of acting on the warning, not because we did not understand it or because we did not believe it, but because the structures and systems and incentives that govern human behaviour would make meaningful change impossible. We would hear the truth and be unable to act on it, and that perhaps is more frightening than any alien visitor could ever be. Valiant Thor may never have existed, but the fear that drove his story is real, and it is still with us, because the weapons are still here, the danger is still real. The path we are on has not fundamentally changed, even though the geopolitical landscape has shifted and the Cold War has ended, and new threats have emerged to replace the old ones. And the question Thor allegedly asked is still unanswered. What will we do with the power we have been given? What will we choose when the choice is between short-term security and long-term survival? Between maintaining the status quo and risking transformation? If someone came to warn us again, if a visitor appeared today with the same message that Thor allegedly delivered more than 60 years ago, would we listen? Would we act? Or would we do what we have always done? Turn away, close the file, return to our daily concerns, and hope that the silence means everything is fine, that the absence of immediate catastrophe means we have more time, that somehow, despite all the warnings and all the close calls and all the evidence that we are living on borrowed time, everything will work out. The Valiant Thor story is not about aliens. It is about us, about our capacity for denial, our resistance to change, our tendency to ignore warnings until it is too late. It is about the gap between knowing what needs to be done and being willing to do it, and that is why the story never dies. Because the gap remains, the question remains, the fear remains, and somewhere perhaps someone is still watching, still waiting, still hoping that we will prove worthy of the power we possess before it is too late. Hey everyone, before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something. If you're enjoying this content, please hit that hype points button. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a huge difference in getting these stories out to more people. And if you feel like it, drop a comment letting me know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, but only if you want to share. No pressure. Alright, let's get into it. October 28th, 1955, Norfolk, Virginia. The morning shift at Betty's diner started like any other. Coffee brewing in the big steel percolator. The smell sharp and bitter and perfect. Bacon sizzling on the griddle. Grease popping in a rhythm Betty Kowalski had known for 8 years. The familiar symphony of a working-class breakfast joint coming to life. Truck drivers at the counter nursing their first cups. Factory workers on break before the shift change. The regulars, all of them, faces Betty knew better than her own family sometimes. She knew what Tommy wanted before he sat down. Black coffee, 2 eggs over easy, rye toast. She knew that Margaret would order oatmeal but only eat half. She knew that the construction crew from the shipyard site would pile into the corner booth and split 3 breakfast platters between 5 men because money was tight and pride was tighter. But the man who stumbled through her door at 7:43 that Tuesday morning was not a regular. Betty noticed him immediately, the way you notice something wrong in a familiar pattern, the way a discordant note stands out in a song you've heard 1,000 times. He wore a navy pea coat, not the modern kind, not the surplus store vintage that sailors sometimes wore. This was genuinely old. The wool was thick and heavy, the kind they stopped making after the war because it cost too much and weighed too much, and modern sailors didn't need that kind of protection anymore. The buttons were tarnished brass, not the polished kind. The collar was worn smooth from years of use, decades maybe. It looked like it belonged in a museum, carefully preserved behind glass with a placard explaining what sailors wore during World War II. But this coat wasn't preserved. It was worn. Recently worn. There was lint on the shoulders, a fresh coffee stain on the cuff. It smelled like mothballs and salt air, and something else Betty couldn't quite place. Something like ozone, like the air before a lightning strike. The man's face was pale, not the healthy pale of someone who worked indoors, but the waxy pale of someone who'd been sick for a long time, or scared for a long time. His eyes were the worst part. They darted around the diner like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in details with desperate intensity. The chrome napkin dispensers, the red vinyl booth seats, the clock on the wall shaped like a coffee cup. He stared at the clock for a full 10 seconds, mouth slightly open, like he couldn't believe what it was telling him. Betty grabbed a menu and a coffee pot, put on her professional smile, the one that said she'd seen everything, and nothing surprised her anymore. She approached his booth. "Morning, hun. Coffee to start?" The man didn't answer, didn't seem to hear her. He was staring at his hands now, turning them over slowly like he was checking to make sure they were still attached. His fingers were trembling. "Sir, you okay?" Betty set the coffee pot down, genuine concern replacing the professional smile. Something was very wrong here. The man finally looked at her, his eyes focused with visible effort. "What year is it?" Betty felt a chill run through her despite the warmth of the diner. 1955, she said carefully. October. The man's face did something strange. Relief and horror fighting for dominance. He laughed, but it came out wrong, like a sob disguised as laughter. 12 years, he whispered. "It's been 12 years. Before Betty could ask what he meant, the man reached into his coat with trembling hands. The movement was jerky, uncoordinated, like he was relearning how to use his arms. He pulled out a manila envelope and Betty noticed his fingernails were wrong. Too long, ragged, like he'd been scratching at something for a very long time. The envelope was old, yellowed at the edges, the kind of paper they'd used during the war when everything was rationed and nothing was wasted. "I need you to keep this," he said. His voice was hoarse, scratched raw. "They're coming. They always come. But maybe this time someone will listen. Maybe this time someone will tell the truth." Betty took the envelope because she didn't know what else to do. The paper felt strange under her fingers, too dry, too fragile. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" The man gripped her wrist suddenly with surprising strength. His skin was cold. "I was on the Eldridge, the visibility test. October 43, Philadelphia. We were there when they turned on the field. We were there when everything went wrong." The diner had gone quiet. Betty hadn't noticed when the conversation stopped, but they had. Everyone was watching now. Tommy at the counter, coffee forgotten. The construction crew, forks suspended halfway to their mouths. Margaret with her hand frozen on her water glass. All of them sensing that something was happening, something they'd tell their families about later, something that would become a story they'd repeat for years. That's when the two men in dark suits walked through the door. They didn't storm in, didn't announce themselves. They simply appeared, and the quality of the air in the diner changed. Betty would think about it later, try to explain it to the police and to herself, and eventually to the journalist who'd come asking questions. The best she could describe it was that the temperature dropped. Not, dramatically, not enough to see your breath. Just a sudden coolness, like someone had opened a freezer door somewhere nearby. The suits were unremarkable. Dark grey, well-tailored but not expensive. The kind of suits that middle management wore, the kind designed to be forgotten 5 minutes after you stopped looking at them. The men themselves were the same. Average height, average build, average faces. Betty couldn't have described them if someone put a gun to her head. Not their hair colour, not their eye colour, not a single distinguishing feature. But the sailor knew them. His entire body went rigid when he saw them. The colour drained from his already pale face. His hand released Betty's wrist and started trembling so badly he had to grip the edge of the table to steady himself. "They found me," he whispered. His voice was barely audible, thick with resignation and fear. "They always find us. Doesn't matter where we go. Doesn't matter how long we run. They always find us." He looked at Betty one more time and she saw tears in his eyes. "Don't let them take it. Please, don't let them bury this again. We deserve to be remembered. We deserve to be real." The men in suits moved with practiced efficiency. No badges shown, no explanations given, no acknowledgement of the other customers watching. They simply took the sailor by the arms, one on each side, and guided him toward the door. He didn't resist, didn't fight. His body went limp between them, like a puppet with cut strings. But at the door he stopped, used what must have been his last reserve of strength to turn his head, to look back at Betty one final time. "We were buried in the field," he said. His voice was clear now, carrying across the silent diner. Every person there heard it. Every person there would remember. Tell them we were buried in the field. Tell them we were real. Tell them we existed. Then he was gone. The suits, the sailor, all of it disappeared through the door. Betty rushed to the window in time to see a black sedan pull away from the curb. She looked for the license plate, some detail to report, to hold on to to prove this had actually happened. There was no plate, just smooth metal where the plate should have been. The diner stayed quiet for a long moment. Then everyone started talking at once. What was that? Who were those men? Should someone call the police? Did you see his face? Did you hear what he said? The questions overlapped, voices rising, everyone trying to make sense of what they'd witnessed. Betty stood there with the envelope in her hands, feeling its impossible lightness, its terrible weight. She looked down at it. The handwriting on the front was shaky, written by someone whose hands wouldn't stop trembling. To whoever finds this, we were there. We were buried in the field. Her hands shook as she opened it. Inside were 3 items, each one a small piece of impossible truth. First, a photograph. Black and white, the edges worn soft from handling. A naval destroyer photographed from the dock, the morning sun catching the grey paint of her hull. The image was slightly out of focus, taken quickly, without time for proper framing, but the hull number was clear. DE-173. Betty didn't know ships, didn't know naval designations, but she knew numbers, and these numbers were stamped clearly on the bow, the USS Eldridge. Second, a slip of paper with coordinates written in the same trembling hand. Numbers and letters that meant nothing to Betty, but would later be identified by people who understood such things as coordinates, marking waters off the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. Third, a date. Just a date. Written larger than the coordinates, underlined 3 times like the writer had wanted to make absolutely sure it couldn't be missed or misunderstood. October the 28th, 1943. Betty looked at the calendar behind her counter. October the 28th, 1955. Exactly 12 years to the day. The sailor's words echoed in her mind. It's been 12 years. She didn't know about the Philadelphia experiment, didn't know the legends, the stories, the whispered rumours that had circulated among certain circles for years. She was a diner owner in Norfolk, Virginia, not a conspiracy theorist, not someone who paid attention to fringe theories about government experiments and wartime secrets. But she knew someone who did pay attention to those things. There was a journalist who'd been coming to the diner for the past few months. Always ordered the same thing, coffee and pie, whatever pie was fresh that day. Always sat in the corner booth with a notebook and a pile of government documents. Always asked questions. Careful questions, polite questions. Questions designed not to spook people but to extract information. He'd been asking about the war, about experiments, about naval facilities and classified programs and sailors who came back different, changed, wrong somehow. Betty had paid attention because that's what diner owners do. They listen. They remember. They connect dots that other people miss. His name was Henry Lockwood, and this envelope would consume the next decade of his life. Act 1. The real history. Henry Lockwood had always been drawn to the stories that lived in the margins, not the headline news, not the official narratives that appeared in polished columns under bylines that people recognised. He chased the stories that made editors uncomfortable, that required more verification than seemed worthwhile, that opened doors to rooms most people preferred to keep locked. He'd started his career covering local corruption in Philadelphia, the kind of grinding investigative work that involved months in dusty archives and interviews with people who spoke in whispers and looked over their shoulders. Then came the war, and Henry had tried to enlist. Flat feet and asthma kept him stateside, kept him watching from a distance as other men his. Age shipped out to Europe and the Pacific, so he'd found another way to serve, covered the home front, the factories, the shipyards, the training facilities, started noticing things that didn't quite add up. Workers at the Philadelphia Naval Yard who wouldn't talk about certain projects, scientists who appeared on personnel lists but whose work was never described, budget allocations that went to programs with no official names. After the war, he'd pivoted to covering what came next, Operation Paperclip, the government's recruitment of Nazi scientists. He'd broken a story about a rocket engineer who'd used slave labour and was now living comfortably in Huntsville, Alabama, building missiles for the army. The story had gotten him death threats and a Peabody nomination in the same week. By the time Betty Kowalski called him about the envelope, Henry Lockwood was exactly the kind of journalist that government agencies watched carefully and ordinary sources trusted implicitly. He'd earned a reputation for protecting his sources, for getting details right, for not publishing until he was absolutely certain. He drove to Norfolk the same day Betty called, listened to her story, took notes in his precise shorthand, asked clarifying questions that revealed he was taking this seriously. He examined the envelope, the photograph, the coordinates, the date. Didn't dismiss it, didn't jump to conclusions, just absorbed the information with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that the truth usually hid in details other people overlooked. "Tell me about the sailor," Henry said, pen poised over his notebook. "Physical description, anything distinctive you remember." Betty described the peacoat, the pale face, the wrong fingernails, the way he'd asked what year it was, the terror when he saw the men in suits. "And the suits," Henry pressed. "Can you describe them?" "That's the thing," Betty said. "I can't. I saw them. We all saw them. But I couldn't tell you what they looked like. Average everything. Forgettable on purpose." Henry wrote that down, underlined it twice. Forgettable on purpose. That was interesting. That suggested training, methodology, purpose. The Philadelphia experiment was not new to Henry. He'd encountered references to it over the years, whispers in the same circles that talked about UFOs and mind control, and other fringe topics that serious journalists learned to avoid. The story went that in October 1943, the Navy had conducted an experiment in invisibility, trying to make the USS Eldridge disappear from enemy radar. Depending on who told the story, the ship had either vanished completely, teleported to Norfolk, or opened a portal to another dimension. It was the kind of story that sounded like science fiction, the kind that legitimate sources denied and conspiracy theorists embraced. Henry had always filed it in the same mental category as alien autopsies and faked moon landings. Interesting, maybe based, on a kernel of truth somewhere, but ultimately unprovable and not worth his limited time. But this envelope changed things. Not because it proved the experiment happened, but because someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to deliver this information. Someone had been scared enough, desperate enough to walk into a random diner and hand classified material to a stranger, and someone else had cared enough to send suits to retrieve that person within minutes. That suggested the story wasn't just fringe theory. It suggested there was something real underneath the legend, something worth protecting, something worth covering up. Henry started with the basics. The photograph showed the USS Eldridge. That much was verifiable. He travelled to Washington, to the Naval History and Heritage Command, the repository of Navy records and documentation, filed the proper requests, showed the proper credentials, and gained access to the official record of the USS Eldridge. The ship was real. Cannon-class destroyer escort, hull number DE-173, commissioned on August 27, 1943 at the Newark shipyard of the Federal Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company. Standard armament for the class, designed for anti-submarine warfare and convoy escort duty. Crew complement of approximately 215 officers and men. The official record showed routine service, shakedown crews, equipment trials, convoy duty in the Atlantic, Mediterranean operations in 44 and 45, survival of the war, transfer to Greece in 51 as part of the military assistance program, renamed Leon, continued service in the Hellenic Navy until decommissioning in the early 70s. Nothing unusual, nothing classified, just another warship with an unremarkable history written in bureaucratic precision. But Henry had learned to read between the lines of official records. He'd learned that what wasn't said was often more important than what was. And the deck logs for October 1943 had some very interesting omissions. Every naval vessel kept detailed daily logs, position reports, weather observations, activities, drills, personnel changes, equipment maintenance. The logs were supposed to be comprehensive, a minute-by-minute record of shipboard life that would allow historians to reconstruct exactly what happened on any given day. Henry had read hundreds of deck logs in his career. He knew the rhythm of them, the standardised language, the level of detail that was considered normal. The Eldridge's logs for September and November 1943 matched that standard. Position fixes given to the minute, activities described in detail, weather recorded multiple times per day. But October was different. The entries were sparse, vague in a way that felt deliberately vague. Position reports gave general areas instead of specific coordinates. East Coast operations instead of exact latitude and longitude. Activities were summarised instead of detailed. Equipment trials and maintenance, instead of descriptions of what equipment was being tested or what maintenance was being performed. And for October 28th, the date on the envelope, the date the sailor had mentioned, the entire entry read, routine maintenance and equipment testing, Brooklyn Navy Yard, no incidents to report. Henry stared at that entry for a long time. No incidents to report was an interesting phrase. It wasn't standard log language. Usually if nothing notable happened, you simply didn't mention it. You listed the routine activities and moved on. But no incidents to report suggested that someone had anticipated there might be incidents, had specifically wanted to make clear for the record that there had not been incidents, had used language that almost invited speculation about what those incidents might have been. It was the kind of phrase that appeared after investigations, after questions from higher up the chain of command, after someone had demanded clarification about something that may or may not have happened. Henry photographed the logs, requested copies through official channels, and started digging into what the Navy had actually been working on in October 1943. World War II had accelerated technological development in ways that were hard to overstate. Radar, sonar, proximity fuses, jet engines, atomic weapons. The line between science fiction and science fact had blurred almost completely. If you'd told someone in 1935 that in 10 years there would be flying bombs, self-guided torpedoes, and weapons that could destroy entire cities with a single explosion, they would have laughed at you. By 1943, the impossible had become routine. Scientists and engineers were pushing boundaries that had seemed inviolable just years earlier. And the Navy, facing submarine warfare that was bleeding the Atlantic supply lines, was willing to try almost anything that might give them an edge. Degaussing was real. Henry found extensive documentation about it. The technique involved wrapping ships in electromagnetic coils that would neutralize the vessel's magnetic signature, protecting against magnetic mines and making submarine detection more difficult. It was standard technology by mid-war, installed on hundreds of ships, completely unclassified. Radar countermeasures were real. Early attempts to reduce radar cross-section, experimental coatings and hull modifications, anything that might make a ship harder to detect on enemy screens. Some of it worked, some of it didn't, but the research was extensive and mostly documented. But then Henry found something that made him pause. Buried in a filing cabinet in the Office of Naval Research Archives, yellowed and forgotten, was a memo dated April 1957, 14 years after the alleged experiment. The subject line read, "Response to inquiry regarding alleged teleportation. Experiment, USS Eldridge, October 1943. Henry's hands trembled slightly as he photographed the document. The memo was brief, written in the clipped bureaucratic language that characterized official denials. It acknowledged that rumors had been circulating about an invisibility or teleportation experiment. It stated clearly and unequivocally that no such experiment had occurred, that the technology required for such an experiment did not exist in 1943 and still did not exist in 1957. But then came the final paragraph, the one that Henry read 3 times to make sure he was understanding it correctly. However, it should be noted that electromagnetic field research was conducted at the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard during the relevant time period. Said research was classified under Project Rainbow and related to degaussing and countermeasure development. While no experiments involving teleportation or invisibility occurred, the presence of this research and the associated equipment installations may have contributed to misunderstandings among personnel not briefed on the program's actual purpose. All records related to Project Rainbow remain classified and are not available for public review. Project Rainbow. Henry felt something shift in his understanding. This wasn't a complete denial. This was an acknowledgement disguised as a denial. The Navy was admitting that classified electromagnetic research had been conducted at Philadelphia in October 1943. They were admitting the research was significant enough to still be classified 14 years later. They were even admitting that the research might have been mysterious enough to confuse people who saw it. What they weren't doing was explaining what Project Rainbow actually was. Henry spent the next month searching for anything related to Project Rainbow. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests, interviewed retired naval officers, traced budget allocations through congressional records. Most of what he found was redacted or missing, pages removed from files with notes saying classified material removed or transferred to secure storage. But he did find one interesting connection. Rainbow was indeed a real naval code name, used not just for one project but as an umbrella designation for multiple countermeasure research programs. Radar jamming, magnetic camouflage, acoustic deception, anything designed to make enemy detection more difficult or confused, which raised an obvious question. If Rainbow was just a code name for conventional countermeasure research, why was it still classified in 1957? Degassing was public knowledge. Radar jamming was public knowledge. What exactly had the Rainbow program been working on that still couldn't be revealed more than a decade after the war ended? Henry's next lead came from the Philadelphia experiment's most famous witness, a man named Carl Meredith Allen. Sometimes he went by Carlos Allende, sometimes just Carlos Allen. He'd sent letters to the Office of Naval Research in the 1950s claiming to have witnessed the experiment firsthand. Henry had read copies of those letters years ago, when he first encountered the Philadelphia experiment story. They were strange documents, rambling and marginalia-filled, written in a distinctive style that mixed technical language with mystical speculation. Allen claimed he'd been serving on a merchant ship, the SS Andrew Furuseth, and had watched the Eldridge disappear from Philadelphia and reappear in Norfolk. The Navy had dismissed the letters as crackpot nonsense. Henry had initially agreed. But after finding the Project Rainbow memo, he decided to track down Allen's surviving family and see if there was anything more to the story. Allen had died in 1994, but his sister still lived outside Philadelphia. Henry called her, explained he was researching wartime naval operations, mentioned her brother's name carefully, watching for her reaction. There was a long silence on the phone. Then, "You're the first person to ask about Carl in years. Most people think he was crazy." "Was he?" Henry asked gently. Another pause. "I don't know. He saw something. Something that scared him for the rest of his life. Whether it was what he claimed it was, I can't say. But he wasn't lying. He believed every word he wrote." Henry drove to Pennsylvania the next day. Allen's sister Margaret met him at a coffee shop. She was in her 70s, cautious, protective of her brother's memory, but also tired of carrying the burden of his obsession alone. He started talking about it in the late 40s, Margaret explained. Would wake up from nightmares, describing this green light, this horrible humming sound. He'd draw diagrams of ships surrounded by coils, said the Navy was experimenting with things they didn't understand, that they'd opened something they couldn't close. Did he keep any records, notes, journals, anything? Margaret hesitated. He kept a diary, made me promise not to let anyone see it while he was alive. Said it was too dangerous, but he's been gone for years now, and I'm old. I'd rather someone knew the truth, whatever the truth is, than let it die with me. She went to her car, returned with a leather-bound journal. The cover was water-stained, the pages yellowed. The title on the first page, written in careful script, Project Rainbow Observations. Henry's pulse quickened. Carl Allen, the supposed crackpot, had used the exact code name that appeared in classified Navy documents. A code name that wasn't public knowledge in the 1950s. A code name he couldn't possibly have known unless he'd actually encountered it somewhere. Somehow. "May I make copies?" Henry asked. Margaret nodded. "That's why I brought it. I want someone to know. I want someone to care." Henry spent 3 days going through the diary, photographing every page, taking notes, cross-referencing details with what he'd already learned. The journal was exactly as strange as Alan's letters had been. Parts of it were lucid, detailed observations of ships and dates and locations. Other parts devolved into paranoid speculation about government surveillance and parallel dimensions. But scattered throughout were specific technical details that felt authentic. References to electromagnetic coils and vacuum tubes, descriptions of equipment being transferred from Philadelphia to Brooklyn in late October 1943. Mentions of scientists and mathematicians working on classified Navy projects. And one entry, dated November 1943, that made Henry stop breathing for a moment. Met a sailor today outside a bar in Philadelphia. He approached me when he saw my merchant marine jacket. Said he'd been on the Eldridge during the test. Wouldn't give his name. Said they'd been ordered not to talk, that there would be consequences if anyone found out. But he was scared. Needed to tell someone. Described the field activation, the green-blue light that surrounded the ship. The way the air seemed to crack and fold. He said it worked at first. Said the ship actually disappeared from view. But then something went wrong. The field became unstable. Some of the crew started hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. Others experienced time skipping forward in jumps, missing minutes. He said 2 men walked through a bulkhead without meaning to, just stepped forward and passed through solid steel like it wasn't there. When the field finally collapsed and they could see properly again, one of those men was embedded in the metal. They had to cut him out. He died screaming. The Navy called it a training accident, but it wasn't an accident. It was the field. The field did something to reality itself. The sailor said the surviving crew members were examined by Navy doctors who diagnosed them with disorientation, sensory confusion, temporary psychological breaks. But he said it was more than that. Said they'd gone somewhere else during the test, brought something back with them. Something that watched them. Something that followed them. He begged me not to tell anyone. Said if I cared about him, I'd forget we ever talked. Then he left. I never saw him again. If anyone ever asks, I'll say this conversation never happened. But I'm writing it here because someone needs to know. Someone needs to remember that we're not alone in the world. That there are spaces between spaces, and the Navy opened a door to one of those spaces in October 1943. ASTI 2, the first cracks in the story. The coordinates from the envelope led Henry to the Delaware River, to a section of waterfront that had once been part of the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The facility had been decommissioned decades ago, its functions transferred to other locations, its real estate carved up and sold off. What had been a vital military installation was now a patchwork of commercial developments, industrial parks, and empty lots waiting for the next round of redevelopment. But this particular stretch of waterfront was different. Henry noticed it as soon as he pulled up. On either side, development had marched forward aggressively. New condominiums, office buildings, warehouses. But here, a gap. A stretch of perhaps 200 yards that had been left completely untouched. Chain-link fence, rust-stained and sagging. Warning signs faded to illegibility. Beyond the fence, nothing but weeds and crumbling concrete and the slow reclamation of nature. It was the kind of gap that raised questions. Why hadn't this land been developed? Who owned it? Why was it sitting empty while valuable waterfront property elsewhere sold for premium prices? Henry had learned to notice gaps like this. They were the bureaucratic equivalent of redacted text in documents. Spaces where something should be but wasn't. Absences that drew attention by their very emptiness. He parked his car, grabbed his camera and found a spot where the fence had rusted through enough to slip past. The ground beyond was uneven, concrete broken and heaved by years of freeze-thaw cycles. Rebar jutted from the ground at angles. Old machinery parts lay half buried in dirt and vegetation. The coordinates led him to what had once been a pier. The structure itself was mostly gone. Wooden pilings rotted away to stumps, decking collapsed into the river. But the foundations remained. Massive concrete mooring points, built to last decades, maybe centuries. The kind of permanent infrastructure the military installed when they expected to use a facility for a very long time. Henry walked the length of what had been the pier, photographing everything, taking measurements, trying to reconstruct what the facility would have looked like in 1943, and that's when he saw the sign. It was mounted on one of the concrete mooring points, barely visible under decades of grime and corrosion, a metal plaque, the kind the military used for designation markers. Henry almost missed it. Would have missed it if the afternoon sun hadn't caught the metal at just the right angle. He scraped at the surface with his car keys, clearing away enough dirt to read the text. The lettering was still sharp, stamped deep into the metal. Restricted area, authorized personnel only, authorization code, Rainbow 1943. Henry's hands were shaking as he photographed the sign. Here it was. Physical evidence, impossible to dismiss or explain away. Project Rainbow hadn't been a filing error or a coincidental code name. It had been significant enough to designate an entire section of the naval shipyard. Significant enough to require specific authorization codes. Significant enough to restrict access, even during a war when security was paramount everywhere. He spent the next hour searching the area for anything else that might have survived. And what he found made his skin prickle despite the summer heat. Scorch marks on the concrete. Not fire damage. Not the kind of charring you'd expect from industrial accidents or wartime activity. These were different. Circular patterns, perfectly symmetrical, radiating out from a central point like someone had drawn them with a giant compass. The marks were deep, the concrete itself altered in ways that shouldn't be possible. Henry crouched down, ran his fingers over the scorched surface. The concrete felt smooth, almost glassy in places, like it had been melted and then rapidly cooled. The pattern repeated multiple times across the pier foundation, always the same circular shape, always radiating from a central point. He photographed the marks from multiple angles, measured their dimensions, collected samples of the affected concrete by chipping off small pieces and sealing them in evidence bags. Later, he'd have them analysed by a materials engineer at MIT who owed him a favour. The engineer's report would arrive 3 weeks later, and it would raise more questions than it answered. The concrete had been exposed to sustained temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. But the heat hadn't come from conventional sources. The damage pattern suggested electromagnetic heating, like what you'd see in an induction furnace, but on a massive scale and applied in precise circular patterns. "I've never seen anything like this," the engineer wrote in his analysis. The precision required to create these patterns, the heat levels needed, the fact that it's focused in such specific areas while leaving surrounding concrete untouched. Whatever caused this, it wasn't conventional technology. At least not any conventional technology I'm aware of. And the really strange part? Based on the depth of heat penetration into the concrete, this happened all at once. Not over time, not from repeated exposure. Someone or something applied massive electromagnetic energy in a single event, and these marks are what remains. But Henry didn't have that analysis yet as he stood on the abandoned pier in the fading afternoon light. All he had were strange scorch marks, and a growing certainty that something significant had happened here. Something that the official record had carefully avoided documenting. Back in the archives, Henry focused on the Eldridge's movements during October 1943. The official record said the ship had spent most of that month in New York, conducting trials and equipment installation at the Brooklyn Naval Yard. Standard procedure for a newly commissioned vessel. Nothing unusual about that. But Henry had learned to look at not just what was recorded, but how it was recorded. And the transfer logs for that period had some interesting anomalies. Standard naval procedure required detailed manifests for any equipment transfer. What was being moved, why it was being moved, who authorised the transfer, where it came from, where it was going. The Navy was obsessive about documentation. Everything had to be tracked, verified, receipted. It was how the military prevented theft, ensured accountability, maintained the paper trail that bureaucracies required to function. But on October 26, 1943, there was an entry in the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard transfer logs that violated all those standard procedures. Special equipment transfer to Brooklyn Naval Yard. authorization code Rainbow. No manifest required. Classification level restricted. Transfer completion to be confirmed by receiving facility. No manifest required. That was unusual enough to be noteworthy. Equipment transfers without manifests were rare, reserved for highly classified material that couldn't be described in standard documentation. But the classification level being listed as restricted, rather than using standard designations like confidential, secret or top secret, was even stranger. Restricted suggested a compartmentalized program, something so sensitive that standard classification levels didn't apply. The transfer was logged as complete on October 29th, one day after the date on the envelope, one day after the alleged experiment. The timing was too precise to be coincidental. Henry tried to find records of what had been transferred, who had authorized it, where the equipment had come from, where it had gone after arriving in Brooklyn. Every angle he pursued led to the same dead end. Missing files, redacted documents, transfer records that had been removed from archives with notes saying classified material relocated to secure storage, or simply file not found. It was a pattern he'd seen before, the bureaucratic equivalent of burning evidence. You couldn't make records disappear completely, that would be too obvious. But you could scatter them, classify them at different levels, move them to facilities with restricted access, essentially bury them so deep that finding all the pieces became effectively impossible. But sometimes pieces survived in unexpected places. Henry found one such piece in a budget report for the Philadelphia Naval Shipyard Research Division. It was routine financial documentation, the kind of mundane paperwork that got filed and forgotten because no one imagined it would ever be interesting. But buried in a list of consultant payments for the fall of 1943 was an entry that made Henry lean closer to the microfilm reader. Consultant Services, Civilian Mathematician, 3 days, October 25 through October 27, Philadelphia Facilities, Classification Restricted, Payment processed through ONR Special Projects account. The consultant's name was redacted, but the file reference number included initials, JVN John von Neumann. It had to be. How many civilian mathematicians with those initials would have been consulting for the Navy in October 1943? How many would have been working on projects classified at special restricted levels? John von Neumann was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Mathematician, physicist, computer scientist, polymath. He'd worked on the Manhattan Project, contributed to quantum mechanics, pioneered game theory, helped develop the first programmable computers. If there had been a classified Navy project involving advanced physics and electromagnetic theory in 1943, von Neumann would have been exactly the kind of person they'd bring in as a consultant. And the dates: October 25th through 27th, 3 days that ended one day before the alleged experiment on October 28th. Von Neumann would have left Philadelphia just as the test was being prepared, having provided the mathematical framework, the theoretical foundation, whatever expertise the Navy needed to attempt something unprecedented. Henry tried to find more information about von Neumann's work for the Navy in 1943. Hit the same walls he'd hit with everything else related to Project Rainbow. Redacted files, missing records, vague references to classified consulting work with no details about what that work entailed. But he had the initials, he had the dates, he had evidence that one of the world's leading mathematicians had been in Philadelphia, working on a restricted project right before the alleged experiment. The pieces were starting to connect, not conclusively, not in a way that would convince skeptics, but enough to show a pattern, enough to suggest that something real had happened beneath the layers of denial and misdirection. Henry knew he needed more. Documents and dates were important, but they could be explained away. He needed witnesses. People who'd been there, who'd seen what happened, who could provide first-hand testimony that matched the documentary evidence. Finding those witnesses would prove to be the hardest part of the investigation, and the most disturbing. Act 3. What really happened in 1943. Finding witnesses to something that officially never happened was like trying to reconstruct a photograph that had been deliberately torn into pieces and scattered. Henry started with the Eldridge's crew manifest. the official list of officers and enlisted men who'd served on the ship during her commissioning and early operations. Most of them were dead. 70 years had passed. The youngest would be in their late 80s or early 90s now. Heart disease, cancer, accidents, the simple attrition of time. Henry cross-referenced the manifest with veteran death records, tracked down obituaries, built a database of who'd survived and where they might be found. Out of a crew of 215, he found 37 men still alive. He started calling, introduced himself as a journalist researching naval operations during World War II, asked if they'd be willing to talk about their service. Most conversations ended quickly. Not interested. Don't remember much. Too old for this. Click. Henry expected that. People got tired of talking about the war. Memories faded. Some wounds never healed enough to discuss casually with strangers, but some reactions were different, more pointed. As soon as Henry mentioned the Eldridge in October 1943, the conversation changed. I can't help you. I don't know anything about that. You should talk to the Navy if you have questions. Click. Those reactions were interesting. Not I don't remember, but I can't help you. Not forgetfulness, but unwillingness. Like they'd been told not to talk. Like they were still following orders from 7 decades ago. Then Henry expanded his search. He started looking not just at Eldridge crew members, but at sailors who'd been stationed at the Philadelphia or Brooklyn naval yards during October 1943. Men who might have seen something, witnessed something, even if they hadn't been directly involved. That's how he found Edward Ryan. Ryan had served on the USS Engstrom, another destroyer escort that had been in Philadelphia for trials and equipment installation at the same time as the Eldridge. When Henry called, Ryan didn't hang up, didn't give an immediate refusal. Instead, there was a long silence after Henry mentioned the Eldridge's name. Finally Ryan spoke. His voice was quiet, careful. I was wondering when someone would finally ask about that. Been carrying it for 70 years. Figured I'd die with it. Maybe that would be easier. Would you be willing to meet in person? Henry asked, trying to keep the excitement out of his voice. Another pause. Yes, but not over the phone, not where anyone will see us. I don't know if they still watch, but I'm not taking chances. They met 3 days later at Ryan's house in Rhode Island, a small ranch-style home near the coast. The walls were decorated with naval memorabilia, photos of ships, deployment certificates, shadow boxes containing medals and ribbons, the proud displays of a career sailor who'd served honourably and remembered that service with satisfaction. But there were no photos of the Engstrom. Henry noticed that. The ship Ryan had served on during the exact period they were about to discuss was absent from all the carefully curated displays. Ryan made coffee with hands that trembled slightly. Not palsy, not age-related tremor. The trembling of someone who was nervous, scared maybe. Finally about to share something he'd kept secret for most of his life. They sat at his kitchen table. Henry set up his tape recorder, asked permission to record. Ryan nodded. Might as well. If I'm going to do this, might as well do it properly. Tell me about October 1943, Henry began. Ryan took a sip of coffee, stared out the window at the ocean, started talking. We were docked at Philadelphia for equipment installation. The Engstrom was new, still getting fitted out, with all the gear we'd need for convoy duty. Radar, sonar, depth charges, all the standard stuff. We were scheduled to be there for 2 weeks, maybe 3. Routine work. The Eldridge was there too, further down the pier. She was newer than us, commissioned just a couple of months earlier. I remember seeing her arrive because she had all this special equipment being installed. Big coils, massive generators, cables everywhere. They put up fencing around her berth, posted guards. That wasn't unusual. Lots of ships got special equipment back then. Classified stuff we weren't supposed to know about, so we didn't pay much attention. Ryan paused, his hands tightening around the coffee mug. October 28th. Clear day, good weather. I was on deck that afternoon doing routine maintenance, checking ropes, inspecting fittings, the kind of busy work they give sailors when there's not enough real work to keep everyone occupied. That's when I heard it. This sound. Not an engine, not machinery. Something else. High-pitched, almost beyond hearing, but you could feel it more than hear it. Made my teeth hurt, made my bones vibrate. I looked over at the Eldridge to see where it was coming from. The sound was coming from her, from those coils they'd installed. They were active, glowing slightly like they were heating up. And then there was light. Ryan stopped, took another sip of coffee. His hands were shaking harder now. What kind of light? Henry prompted gently. Green-blue, like nothing I'd ever seen before or since. Not like fire, not like electricity. Something else. It started as a shimmer around the ship, like heat waves on a summer day. But then it got thicker, more solid. Like fog, but not fog because you could see through it, but also couldn't see through it at the same time. The light wrapped around the Eldridge, covered her completely. And then... Ryan's voice dropped to a whisper. Then she wasn't there anymore. I don't mean she disappeared like magic. I mean 1 second I was looking at a destroyer escort, and the next second I was looking at empty water. The moorings were still there. The gangplanks were still there, leading to nothing. The fencing, the guards, the equipment on the dock, all of it still there. But no ship. I thought I was losing my mind. Looked around, saw other sailors on deck, saw the same confusion on their faces. We were all seeing it. All seeing nothing where a 300-foot warship should have been. How long was she gone? Henry asked. Maybe 30 seconds. Maybe a minute. Hard to say. Time felt wrong, stretched out. Then the light appeared again, and the ship came back. Just materialised out of nothing. Exactly where she'd been. Like she'd never left. But something was different. Even from my ship I could see something was wrong. Men running on deck, officers shouting. And this sound, this screaming. Not scared screaming, not pain screaming. Something worse. Like the sound someone makes when they've seen something that broke their understanding of reality. The guards rushed in, started clearing everyone away. Officers came running from the shipyard offices. We were ordered below deck immediately, told not to discuss what we'd seen, told it was a classified test and talking about it would be considered treason. Next day, the Eldridge was gone. Moved to Brooklyn, they said. Emergency transfer for additional equipment installation. And anyone who'd been on deck during the test, anyone who'd seen what happened, got called in for medical evaluation. Ryan pulled out an old folder, the kind veterans kept with their discharge papers and service records. Inside was a medical form, yellowed with age, dated October 31st, 1943. Henry read the diagnosis. Severe disorientation, sensory confusion, temporary vision disruption. Recommend observation for possible neurological effects from equipment malfunction exposure. Equipment malfunction, Ryan said bitterly. That's what they called it. An equipment malfunction that made a ship disappear. An equipment malfunction that scrambled the minds of everyone who saw it. They examined all of us. Physical exams, neurological tests, psychological evaluations. Asked the same questions over and over. What did you see? What do you remember? Are you experiencing headaches, nausea, disorientation? They had experts explain it to us. Scientists with charts and equations. Made it sound perfectly normal, perfectly explainable. Some kind of optical phenomenon created by the experimental equipment. A mass hallucination caused by electromagnetic interference with brain function. Nothing to worry about. Nothing that actually happened. But it wasn't an optical phenomenon. I know what I saw, and I know what happened to the other men who were there. 7 of us total from the Engstrom were on deck that afternoon. 3 of them had complete nervous breakdowns within a month, had to be medically discharged, spent time in naval psychiatric facilities. 2 more committed suicide before the war ended. The Navy said it was combat stress, coincidence, the normal toll of warfare. But I knew different. Those men were fine before the test. Strong, stable, good sailors. What they saw that day broke something in them. What about you? Henry asked quietly. How did you cope? Ryan was silent for a long moment. I started drinking, heavily. It took me years to stop. Even now, I have nightmares. Not about combat, not about anything else from the war. Just that green light. That impossible moment when reality stopped making sense. I wake up and I can still feel it. That wrongness, like the world around me is just a thin shell over something vast and incomprehensible. What do you think happened? Henry asked. Honestly? Ryan looked him in the eye. I think they were trying to make the ship invisible to radar. Maybe to the naked eye too. I think they succeeded. And I think, whatever method they used had effects they didn't anticipate, didn't understand, couldn't control. That's what I think happened. They tore a hole in something, opened a door that should have stayed closed, and they couldn't close it properly. Henry left Rhode Island with the tape recording, the medical document, and a list of names. Ryan had given him other sailors who'd been in Philadelphia that day, men who might still be alive, who might be willing to talk. The second witness Henry tracked down was Michael Torres. Unlike Ryan, Torres hadn't been in Philadelphia at all. He'd been stationed in Norfolk, Virginia, serving on a supply ship, 500 miles away from the alleged experiment. But Torres had his own story, and it matched the legend in ways that made Henry's hand shake as he took notes. They spoke over the phone. Torres lived in Arizona now, far from any ocean, far from anything that might remind him of his Navy service. He sounded wary when he answered, but something in Henry's questions made him decide to talk. October 28th, 1943, Torres began. We were loading cargo at the Norfolk docks. Standard supply run, nothing unusual. Around 2 in the afternoon, someone started shouting, pointing at the harbour. There was a ship there, just appeared. Didn't sail in, didn't come from anywhere we could see. It was just suddenly there in the middle of the harbour where no ship had been seconds before. I saw the hull number, D173, the USS Eldridge. I remember because one of our officers checked the fleet positions, got on the radio, started asking what the hell a destroyer escort was doing in Norfolk when she was supposed to be in Philadelphia. The ship looked wrong. That's the best way I can describe it. The outline was sharp, but somehow blurred at the same time, like looking at something through water or heat shimmer, and there was this green tint to the air around it, this glow that didn't come from any source I could identify. We watched it for maybe 10 minutes. Everyone on the dock stopped working, just stared. Then it vanished, same way it appeared, just gone like it had never been there. When our officer finally got through to Philadelphia Naval Yard, they confirmed the Eldridge was there, had been there all day, never left. But I saw it. We all saw it. A ship can't be in 2 places at once, unless something impossible happened. Henry pulled up the Navy cargo logs for Norfolk on October 28th. He'd checked them before, found nothing unusual in the official entries, but this time he looked more carefully at the handwritten notes in the margins, the unofficial comments that dock workers sometimes scribbled. One entry, logged at 1400 hours, right around the time Torres described. The official entry was routine, standard harbour operations, loading and unloading, nothing noteworthy. But in the margin, in barely legible handwriting, unexpected hull presence. Detected, approximate location Pier 7. No identification available. No record of scheduled arrival. Duration approximately 10 minutes. Phenomenon unexplained. Recommend further investigation. No ship name attached, but the timing matched perfectly. The location matched perfectly. And the language, unexpected hull presence, suggested radar or visual detection of something that shouldn't have been there. The Philadelphia experiment legend had always claimed the Eldridge disappeared from Philadelphia and reappeared in Norfolk. Henry had dismissed that as embellishment, the kind of detail that got added to stories over time, but here was evidence, not conclusive but compelling, that something matching that description had actually occurred. Henry found one more piece of evidence before moving to the next phase of his investigation, and it was the most disturbing thing he'd discovered yet. In a box of declassified documents from the Office of Naval Research Photographic Archives, buried among hundreds of unremarkable images, he found a photograph stamped with a classification level that had been downgraded to unclassified in 1990. The date on the stamp, October the 1943. The source, Philadelphia Naval Shipyard. The image was blurry, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It showed the deck of a ship, metal structures, equipment, and in the foreground, partially obscured by what might have been smoke or fog or some kind of distortion field, was something that looked disturbingly like a human shape, but the shape wasn't standing on the deck. It was embedded in the metal, fused into the steel plating. The outline was clear enough: arms extended, torso twisted, head tilted at an unnatural angle. Like someone had been walking forward when the metal suddenly became solid around them, trapping them permanently in the structure of the ship itself. Henry stared at the photograph for a long time, trying to find some other explanation. A trick of light and shadow, an artifact of the photographic process, anything other than what it appeared to be. He brought the image to the Navy archivist who'd been helping him access documents, showed it without comment, waited for a reaction. The archivist's face went pale. He looked at the file number, looked at Henry, looked back at the photograph. "This file was misfiled," he said quietly. "This shouldn't be in the declassified archives. It should never have been accessible to public research. You need to return it immediately." "What is it?" Henry asked. "What am I looking at?" The archivist wouldn't answer, just kept repeating that the file needed to be returned, that Henry hadn't seen it, that some things remained classified for very good reasons, and this was one of them. But Henry had already photographed it, already made copies, already secured the evidence in multiple locations so it couldn't simply disappear. He left the archives knowing he'd crossed a line. The investigation was no longer theoretical. He had witnesses, he had documents, he had physical evidence, and he had a photograph that suggested something truly horrific had happened aboard the USS Eldridge in October 1943. Now he needed to know what happened after, how the Navy had responded, what they'd done to contain the situation, and whether the experiment had truly ended, or if it had simply gone underground, hidden where no one would think to look. The answer to those questions would prove more disturbing than anything he'd discovered so far, to be continued in Part 2. The Men Who Didn't Return. Part 2. The Cover-Up Actee. 4. The Cover-Up. The pattern emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical baths. Henry had been investigating government cover-ups long enough to recognise the fingerprints of institutional misdirection. It wasn't aggressive suppression, it wasn't men in black threatening witnesses or breaking into offices to steal files. That would be too obvious, too dramatic, too likely to draw attention. Instead, it was subtle, bureaucratic, almost invisible unless you knew what to look for. Documents that should exist but didn't. Files misfiled in ways that made them effectively impossible to locate. Witnesses who couldn't quite remember or weren't quite sure. Evidence that existed but couldn't be verified or authenticated through normal channels. The Philadelphia experiment wasn't buried under threats and intimidation. It was buried under confusion and plausible deniability. Henry noticed it first with the deck logs. He'd photographed the USS Eldridge's logs for October 1943, noted how sparse and vague they were compared to other months. But when he examined the physical documents more closely, comparing them to logs from September and November, he found something interesting. The paper was different. The September and November logs were written on standard Navy issue forms from 1943. Slightly yellowed, consistent aging, the paper quality matching other wartime documents. But the October logs used different paper, whiter, crisper, the kind of stock that came into use in the early 50s. The typewriter font was different too. September and November used one style, slightly faded, the letters showing the wear patterns of a machine that had seen heavy use. October used a different typewriter entirely, the letters sharper, more uniform, newer. Henry photographed the differences, brought them to a documents examiner he'd worked with on previous investigations. The examiner confirmed what Henry suspected. The October logs had been retyped sometime in the early 1950s, transferred from original documents onto new paper using a different typewriter. "Why would they do that?" the examiner asked. "To change the content," Henry said, "or to remove details that were in the originals. You retype the logs, include only what you want preserved, destroy the originals, and claim the new versions are the real record." He checked the archive transfer documents, found a notation that the original October 43 logs had been marked as damaged and illegible in January 1952. They'd been retyped for preservation purposes, and the originals had been listed as unable to locate in subsequent inventory checks. 9 years after the alleged experiment, someone had gone through the Eldridge's records and systematically replaced the October logs with sanitised versions. Not destroyed them completely, that would raise too many questions. Just retyped them, made them vaguer, removed whatever specific details had been in the originals. Then Henry found the memo. It was buried in the Office of Naval Research Files dated November 1955, just weeks after the sailor had stumbled into Betty's diner in Norfolk. The timing couldn't be coincidental. The memo was brief, marked for limited distribution to facility commanders and security officers. The subject line read, "Guidance regarding Project Rainbow inquiries. Recent unauthorized disclosures have resulted in increased public inquiry regarding historical Navy research programs, specifically those conducted under the Rainbow designation during World War II. Personnel are instructed to terminate all discussions of these programs and refer any questions to the Office of Naval Research Security Division for official response. No statements regarding Rainbow research should be made without prior approval from ONR Command. All documentation related to Rainbow programs remains classified and is not available for public review. Violations of these guidelines will be treated as unauthorized disclosure of classified information. Terminate discussions, not answer questions, not clarify misunderstandings, not provide factual corrections. Terminate." That was interesting language for a project that supposedly never existed, or had been nothing more than routine degaussing research. Henry's investigation was starting to attract attention. He noticed it gradually, the way you notice the temperature dropping degree by degree. Nothing dramatic at first, just small things that individually meant nothing but collectively suggested surveillance. A car that seemed to be parked near his apartment more often than random chance would explain. Same make and model, different license plates, but always someone sitting in the driver's seat reading a newspaper. Phone calls where no one spoke on the other end. Not wrong numbers, not telemarketers, just silence and the faint sound of someone breathing, listening. His hotel rooms in Washington showing signs of having been searched. Nothing dramatic, nothing stolen. Just small things out of place. Clothes folded slightly differently than he'd left them. Papers in his briefcase rearranged. His notebook moved from one side of the desk to the other. Henry wasn't paranoid. He'd dealt with government. Surveillance before, knew what it looked like, knew how to recognise when someone was keeping tabs on your activities. But this felt more focused than his previous experiences, more interested in what he was finding and who he was talking to. He started taking precautions, made copies of everything, stored them in multiple locations, safety deposit boxes, trusted friends, lawyers' offices, varied his routines, took different routes to meetings, checked for tails before conducting interviews. Then Edward Ryan called. "I found something," Ryan said. His voice was excited, breathless. "Was going through old papers from my service, stuff I hadn't looked at in decades. There's a letter from someone who was on the Eldridge. He wrote to me in '44, said he needed to tell someone what really happened. I'd forgotten about it completely, but it's here, and Henry, it confirms everything." "Can you send it to me?" Henry asked. "I'm going to make copies first, mail them to different addresses, just in case. I know it sounds paranoid, but after talking to you, after thinking about all this again, I don't want to take chances. Give me a couple of days to get everything organised and I'll call you back." Ryan never called back. 3 days later, Henry got a call from Ryan's daughter. Her father had died, heart attack in his sleep. He was 92 years old, had a history of heart disease, was on medication for high blood pressure. The doctors said it was natural causes, nothing suspicious, just an old man reaching the end of a long life. Henry felt something cold settle in his stomach. The timing, just days after Ryan had found something important, just days after he talked about making copies and sending them to safe locations. "I'm sorry for your loss," Henry said carefully. "Your father was a good man. He told me a lot about his service." "He enjoyed talking to you," Ryan's daughter said. "First time in years he'd really opened up about the war. He seemed lighter after your conversation, like he'd put down a burden he'd been carrying too long." They talked for a few more minutes. Arrangements, funeral details, Then, as they were about to hang up, Ryan's daughter mentioned something that made Henry's pulse quicken. Oh, there was something strange. 2 men came to the house the day after Dad died. Said they were from the Veterans Affairs Office, needed to collect his service records for processing. Very official, had ID badges and everything, but they didn't leave any paperwork, didn't give us any receipts, just took a box from Dad's study and left. Henry gripped the phone tighter. What did these men look like? I don't know. Average, I guess. Dark suits. I can't really remember their faces. Is that weird? I saw them, talked to them, but I couldn't describe them if you asked me. The same description Betty Kowalski had given. The same impossibility of remembering details. Men designed to be forgotten. Did they take anything else, besides the box? I'm not sure. Dad's study was kind of a mess. He'd been looking for something in there the day before he died, pulling out old folders and papers. I was going to help him clean it up after I finished work, but then he... She trailed off. Henry attended the funeral, paid his respects, talked to Ryan's family, didn't mention his suspicions. But after the service, when everyone else had left, he sat in his car in the cemetery parking lot and thought about the timing. Ryan finds evidence. Ryan dies 3 days later. Men in suits arrive immediately and remove his papers. A 92-year-old man with heart disease dying suddenly is unremarkable. Unless you knew what he'd been about to reveal. Unless you knew someone had a very strong interest in making sure that evidence never surfaced. Henry knew he was running out of time. The story was coming together, but it was also falling apart. Witnesses dying, documents disappearing, his own investigation increasingly compromised. He needed something definitive, something they couldn't disappear or explain away, something that would prove beyond doubt that the Philadelphia experiment had been real. He needed to find someone who'd been directly involved, someone on the inside, someone who knew exactly what had happened and could confirm the truth. That's when he found Arthur Calloway. Calloway wasn't listed on the Eldridge's crew manifest. According to Navy records, he'd served on a completely different ship, the USS El Dorado, and had been reported missing in action in 1944 during Mediterranean operations. His family had received a telegram, a flag, condolences from the Secretary of the Navy. But Henry found a discrepancy. It was small, easy to miss. The kind of thing that only emerged when you cross-referenced multiple document types. An insurance form filed by Calloway's family in 1946, trying to collect on a life insurance policy. The form listed his service history, including all ship assignments. And there, buried in the middle of the list, was a single line that didn't appear in any official Navy records. Temporary assignment USS Eldridge, special duty, October 1943. Special duty. That was Navy code for classified assignments. Operations that didn't appear on standard manifests. Henry had seen it before in other contexts. Men pulled from their regular posts for short-term assignments that needed specific expertise or security clearances. So Arthur Calloway had been assigned to the Eldridge in October 43 for special duty. And then he'd been listed as killed in action the following year. Except Arthur Calloway wasn't dead. Henry found him through a combination of bureaucratic archaeology and dumb luck. A death certificate that was filed but then withdrawn. A social security number that had been issued posthumously but showed earnings in later years. A name change petition from 1948 buried in county records in Maine. Arthur Calloway had legally become Arthur Brennan, same person, different identity, and Arthur Brennan lived in a cabin in the woods outside a town in Maine that barely appeared on maps. It took Henry 3 months to piece together the trail. He drove to Maine in late November, when the trees were bare and the first snow was threatening. Found the cabin at the end of a dirt road that looked more like a hiking trail. No mailbox, no number, just a weathered structure that blended into the forest like it had grown there. He knocked on the door, not sure what he'd find. Half expecting another dead end, another witness who'd vanished before he could ask the right questions. But Arthur Calloway answered. 90 years old, lean and weathered like old wood. He looked at Henry for a long moment, seemed to recognise something in his face or his posture, or the desperation in his eyes. "I've been waiting for you," Calloway said. "Or someone like you. Figured eventually someone would piece it together. Come in. We have a lot to talk about. The cabin was sparse. Wood stove, basic furniture, shelves lined with books, no television, no phone that Henry could see, just the essentials for someone who wanted to live far from the modern world. They sat at Calloway's kitchen table. The old man made coffee, strong and black, the kind sailors drink. Then he began to talk, and what he said over the next 6 hours would fundamentally change Henry's understanding of what had happened in Philadelphia in October 1943. "I was a volunteer," Calloway began. "That's important to understand. They asked for volunteers, didn't tell us what for, just said it was classified and important and potentially dangerous. I was young, stupid, thought it would be an adventure, so I raised my hand. There were 30 of us total, pulled from different ships, different bases. They brought us to Philadelphia in late October, put us up in a barracks that had been cleared of all other personnel, told us we'd be testing new equipment, that we couldn't talk about it, that our families would be told we were on routine training exercises. The equipment was already installed on the Eldridge when we arrived. Massive coils wrapped around the hull, generators the size of small cars, cables everywhere. Scientists and engineers working around the clock, checking connections, running tests. The whole ship buzzed with electricity even when the generators were offline." Calloway paused, sipped his coffee. His hands were steady, but Henry could see the cost of remembering in his eyes. "They briefed us on October 27th, told us the goal was to make the ship invisible to radar, revolutionary technology that would save countless lives by protecting convoys from U-boat attacks. They made it sound noble, important, worth the risk. But I could see the scientists were nervous. They kept running calculations, rechecking their math, arguing about field strengths and frequencies. One of them, I overheard him talking to another, said they needed more time, that the margin for error was too small, that they didn't fully understand what would happen when the field reached maximum power. The other scientists said they didn't have more time, that the brass wanted results, that the war was killing thousands of sailors every month and this technology could save them, that they had to try, even if the theory wasn't completely proven. Calloway stood up, walked to the window, looked out at the trees like he was checking to make sure no one was listening. October 28th. Clear day, calm water. They told us to stay below deck during the test. Said the electromagnetic field might affect unshielded personnel. We were in the lower compartments, sealed hatches, no way to see what was happening topside. But we could hear it. That humming. Started low, barely audible, then got louder and louder until it felt like my skull was vibrating. My teeth ached. My bones ached. Like every cell in my body was resonating with that sound. Then the light came. Green-blue light seeping through hatches and portholes. Not normal light. This was alive somehow, pulsing, moving like liquid, and it went through metal, through the hull, through bulkheads, like the ship was becoming transparent from the inside out. Calloway turned back to face Henry. His expression was haunted. That's when everything went wrong. The ship lurched, not like hitting a wave, not like any motion I'd ever felt. Like reality itself shifted sideways. Men started screaming. Some of them were hallucinating, seeing things that weren't there. Shadow figures standing in corners, shapes moving in the walls. Others were experiencing time differently. I'd look at someone, look away for what felt like a second, look back and they'd say 5 minutes had passed. Or time would skip backward and I'd experience the same moment twice. I saw Jenkins. He was a gunner's mate from Boston. I saw him walk toward the bulkhead. He reached out to steady himself and his hand went through the metal. Just passed through like it was air. He pulled back, terrified, stared at his hand like it wasn't his anymore. Then Morrison stepped forward. I think he was trying to help Jenkins, or maybe he was disoriented, I don't know. But he walked into the bulkhead and didn't stop. Just kept going, passed through the metal like it was a curtain. We heard him screaming from the other side, this horrible sound that echoed through the ship. The worst part was what came next. The field started fluctuating, the light pulsing faster and faster, and I started hearing voices. Not from the crew, from somewhere else, whispering in languages I didn't understand. saying things that made my head hurt when I tried to comprehend them. Calloway sat back down, his coffee forgotten and cold. Someone must have hit the emergency shutdown. The humming stopped, the light faded, but it took what felt like hours for reality to settle back into place. When it did, we were in Norfolk. I saw it through the porthole, Norfolk Harbour. But we'd been in Philadelphia. Hundreds of miles in seconds or minutes, or however long the field had been active. Time didn't make sense anymore. They got us back to Philadelphia somehow, never told us how. Then came the examinations, medical, psychological, neurological. They tested everything, took blood samples, ran cognitive assessments, asked the same questions over and over trying to catch inconsistencies in our stories. Of the 30 men who'd volunteered, only 23 made it through intact. 5 were permanently institutionalised, diagnosed with combat fatigue, schizophrenia, neurological damage. But they'd never seen combat. The field had done something to their minds, broken something that couldn't be fixed. 2 more committed suicide within a year. The Navy said it was coincidence, stress of wartime service. But I knew better. They couldn't live with what they'd seen, what they'd felt. The understanding that reality was thinner than we'd believed, that there were spaces between spaces and we'd accidentally looked into one of those spaces. And Morrison, the one who walked through the bulkhead, when the field collapsed and we could see properly again, he was embedded in the metal, fused into the steel plating. They cut him out. Took hours. He was screaming the whole time. Died in the medical bay that night. Henry's recorder was still running. He checked to make sure, needed confirmation that he was capturing this. What did you think they were trying to do? In your opinion, what was the actual goal? Calloway laughed, but there was no humour in it. Make the ship invisible. That's what they told us. Use electromagnetic fields to bend light around the vessel. Make it disappear from enemy radar and visual detection. Revolutionary technology that would win the war. But I don't think that's what actually happened. I think they succeeded in making the ship invisible, just not in the way they planned. They didn't make it invisible to detection. They made it invisible to reality itself. Shifted it out of phase with normal space and time. Pushed it into some other dimension, some other frequency of existence. And when they brought it back, pieces of that other place came with it. I felt it. Felt something watching us. Something that existed in that space we'd accidentally entered. Something that noticed us, paid attention to us. And some of us, we couldn't shake that feeling even after we left the ship. The experiment didn't fail, Calloway continued. It worked. It worked exactly as the theory predicted. That's why they shut it down. That's why they classified everything. Because it worked, and what it did was too dangerous to ever attempt again. But they didn't stop the research, Henry said. Did they? Calloway shook his head. No, they moved it. Took the equipment, the research, the data. Went underground with it. Kept working on it, trying to refine it, trying to figure out how to control what they had accidentally created. How do you know? Because they kept looking for us, the survivors. One by one, we started disappearing. Not dying, disappearing. Reassigned to classified projects, transferred to facilities that didn't appear in official records, simply vanishing from normal Navy rosters. I realised they were collecting us, bringing us back. Maybe to study us, maybe to use us in further experiments. I don't know. So I faked my death, had help from a friend in records, created the paperwork, made it look like I'd been killed in action, changed my name, moved here, stayed off the grid, figured if they thought I was dead they'd stop looking. And did they? Calloway looked out the window again. I don't know. Haven't seen anyone. But I'm always watching, always waiting. After 70 years you'd think I'd relax, but I can't, because I know what they're capable of. I know they're still out there, still working on it, still trying to perfect what they started in October 43. They talked for hours more. Calloway shared details, technical specifications he'd overheard, names of scientists he'd seen, locations of facilities he'd been told about. Henry recorded everything, took notes, asked clarifying questions. As the sun set and shadows filled the cabin, Calloway stood up suddenly. moved to the window with a quickness that belied his age, stared out at the darkening woods. "You need to leave," he said quietly. "Now." "What's wrong?" "I don't know, just a feeling. But after 70 years, I've learned to trust my feelings. You found me, which means they might know you're here. Whatever story you're writing, write it fast and publish it somewhere they can't suppress it. Because once they realise how much you know, they'll come for you too." Henry gathered his things, shook Calloway's hand. "Thank you for everything, for your service, for your courage in telling the truth." Calloway gripped his hand tightly. "Tell them we were real. Tell them it happened. Tell them we existed. That's all I ask." Henry drove through the dark woods, checking his mirrors constantly, half expecting to see headlights following. He made it back to civilization, found a motel, checked in under a false name, and spent the night transcribing his recording and organising his notes. 2 days later, when he called Calloway's number to follow up on a detail, the line was disconnected. He drove back to Maine. The cabin was empty. No furniture, no personal belongings, no sign anyone had lived there in years. The neighbours, the few who existed this far into the woods, claimed the cabin had been abandoned for decades. No one had lived there. No one named Arthur Brennan or Arthur Calloway. But Henry had the recording. He had the notes. He had proof that the conversation had happened. That couldn't be. Erased. Or so he thought. Act 5. The final discovery. Henry knew he was running out of time. The patterns were clear now. Every witness he found either died, disappeared, or recanted. Every document he discovered somehow became unavailable, or was revealed to be a misfile. The story was coming together, but it was also being systematically dismantled. He needed something they couldn't disappear. Something physical, tangible, impossible to explain away. Testimony could be dismissed as unreliable memory. Documents could be called forgeries. But physical evidence, evidence that showed what had been done and could be verified by independent experts, that would be harder to suppress. The Philadelphia Naval Shipyard had been decommissioned in the 1990s. The facilities had been parcelled out, sold off, redeveloped. What had been a vital military installation was now a mishmash of commercial properties, historical landmarks, and empty lots. But certain sections remained. Areas too contaminated to redevelop safely. Structures too expensive to demolish. Spaces that lingered in bureaucratic limbo, owned by entities that had gone bankrupt or transferred to agencies that no longer existed. Henry spent weeks researching old facility maps, comparing them to modern satellite imagery, looking for inconsistencies. Buildings that appeared on wartime documentation, but not on current surveys. Underground structures that had been mapped in the 40s but seemed to have been forgotten. And he found something. A section of the old shipyard that appeared on every map from 1940 through 1969, then disappeared completely from all subsequent documentation. Not labelled as demolished, not marked as redeveloped, just erased as if it had never existed. The area was still there. Henry could see it on satellite images, but it was listed as vacant land owned by a series of shell corporations that led nowhere. No development planned, no historical designation, no acknowledgement of what had once stood there. He went there on a December night. Cold, clear, the kind of night where your breath freezes in front of your face, brought bolt cutters and a flashlight and a camera. Told himself this was investigative journalism, not trespassing, not breaking and entering. The fence was old, rusty, easier to cut through than he'd expected. The grounds beyond were overgrown, nature reclaiming what the military had abandoned, but structures remained. Concrete foundations, metal frameworks, the bones of buildings that had been stripped of everything valuable and left to decay. He searched for 2 hours, following his maps, checking coordinates, looking for the specific structure he'd identified. Almost gave up. Almost decided he'd made a mistake, misread the documentation, chased another dead end. Then he found it. A concrete bunker, mostly buried, covered in decades of vegetation and debris. He almost walked right past it. Only noticed it because his flashlight caught the edge of a steel door, rusted but intact, half hidden under collapsed roof sections and accumulated dirt. The door was sealed, but not locked. Henry pushed, expecting resistance, expecting rust and time to have fused the mechanisms. Instead, it moved smoothly. Recently maintained, recently accessed. Someone had been here. Inside was darkness. Henry's flashlight beam cut through it, revealing concrete stairs descending into the earth. The air was stale but not musty, sealed but not abandoned. He hesitated at the threshold. This was the moment. Once he went down those stairs, there was no pretending this was innocent research. This was breaking into a secure facility, possibly federal property, definitely illegal. But he'd come too far, lost too many witnesses, spent too many years chasing this story. If there were answers down there, if there was proof, he had to find it. Henry descended. The stairs were steep, angled deep into the earth. 20 steps. 30. More. Finally, they opened into a large underground room, and Henry's flashlight revealed something that made him stop breathing. Equipment. Everywhere. Not modern equipment, not recent installations. This was vintage World War II technology, preserved like a museum display, but clearly functional, clearly maintained. Massive coils of copper wire, wound in precise patterns, mounted on metal frameworks. Generators the size of automobiles, their surfaces clean despite their age. Vacuum tubes as large as oil drums, connected by cable runs that crisscrossed the ceiling. Workbenches covered in instruments, oscilloscopes, voltmeters, equipment Henry didn't recognise. Filing cabinets lined one wall. Henry pulled open drawers, found them filled with documents, technical specifications, test results, calculations and diagrams, photographs of ships surrounded by electromagnetic fields. On another wall, a chalkboard. Still legible after decades, equations written in neat script. Mathematical formulas that meant nothing to Henry, but would mean everything to the right physicist. Diagrams showing ships wrapped in field lines, arrows indicating direction and strength. And above the chalkboard, stenciled directly onto the concrete wall in faded letters, rainbow storage, authorised personnel only. Henry photographed everything. The equipment, the documents, the chalkboard, the wall stenciling, worked methodically, making sure he captured every detail, every angle. This was it. This was the proof. Physical evidence that Project Rainbow had existed, that the equipment had been real, that the research had continued long after 1943. He found a logbook on one of the workbenches, opened it carefully, photographed every page. The entries started in 1943 and continued through the 60s. Tests conducted, results recorded, modifications made. A detailed technical diary of an ongoing program. The last entry was dated October 1969, 26 years after the original experiment. Final test series complete. Results inconsistent with theoretical predictions. Field stability remains problematic. Human safety cannot be guaranteed. Equipment decommissioned per Security Council directive. All materials to remain in secure storage. Future access restricted to Security Council clearance only. Research suspended indefinitely. Suspended indefinitely. Not terminated, not destroyed. Suspended. Left in place. Maintained. Waiting for some future date when the research might resume. Henry examined the chalkboard more closely. The equations were beyond his understanding, but certain elements were clear. Electromagnetic field calculations, wave frequencies, resonance patterns, and at the centre of it all, a diagram showing a ship surrounded by concentric circles of varying intensity. Below the diagram, written in neat handwriting, underlined twice, temporal displacement unpredictable. Spatial coordinates require constant recalibration. Field stability inversely proportional to power level. Human biological systems show adverse reactions above 60% field strength. Risk of permanent phase shift cannot be eliminated. recommend research continuation only under strictly controlled conditions with unmanned test subjects. Temporal displacement, not just invisibility, not just radar countermeasures. They'd been trying to manipulate time and space, and they'd succeeded, but couldn't control the results, couldn't prevent the adverse reactions, couldn't guarantee that whatever went into the field would come back unchanged. Henry found one more thing before leaving. A reel-to-reel tape recorder, vintage but functional, with a tape loaded and labelled in faded marker. Test 43, Field Reaction, October the 28th, 1943, original recording. He didn't have time to play it here. Took the entire recorder, carefully disconnecting it from the power source, wrapping it in his jacket to protect it. This tape was evidence. Possibly the most important piece of evidence he'd found. Audio documentation of the actual experiment. Henry took as much as he could carry. Documents from the filing cabinets, the logbook, samples of cable and equipment that could be analysed. Photographed everything else. Then climbed back up the stairs, emerged into the cold night, replaced the door as he'd found it. He knew he was stealing evidence, knew there would be consequences, but he also knew this might be his only chance. If he left everything in place, reported the find through proper channels, it would all disappear. The bunker would be sealed, the equipment removed, the entire site erased from existence, just like everything else connected to Project Rainbow. Back in his hotel room, Henry set up the tape recorder, threaded the tape carefully. It was old, brittle, the kind that could snap if handled roughly. He adjusted the playback speed, set the volume, pressed play. Static at first, hiss and crackle, then voices distant and tinny through 7 decades of degradation. Field generators online, running preliminary power checks, all systems nominal. Confirm crew positioned below deck, all hatches secured. Beginning power increase, field at 20%, visual distortion minimal. The humming started, audible even through the poor recording quality, a low vibration that grew steadily louder as the test progressed. Field at 40%, ship outline becoming indistinct, observation team reports shimmering effect around hull. 60%, significant visual displacement achieved, recommendation from observation team to maintain current power level and gather data. A different voice, more authoritative. Negative, continue power increase to maximum. We need to know the upper limits. Sir, the theoretical models suggest instability above 70%. We're not here to test theory. We're here to test reality. Continue power increase. Field at 80%. Complete visual displacement confirmed. Ship is no longer visible from observation point. Instruments showing anomalous readings. Recommend immediate shutdown. Continue to 100%. Field at 90%, sir. We're detecting spatial distortion. The ship's coordinates are becoming uncertain. Equipment is showing conflicting position data. Maximum power now. Then everything changed. The orderly progression of voices dissolved into chaos. Overlapping shouts, panic, someone screaming about the crew. The field is unstable. We're losing coherence. Spatial readings are impossible. The ship is in multiple locations simultaneously. Reports from below deck. Crew experiencing severe disorientation. Some kind of temporal displacement. They're describing impossible things. Shut it down. Emergency shutdown protocols. The humming reached a crescendo. Became almost painful even through the recording. Then it began to decrease. Power levels dropping as emergency procedures kicked in. Field collapsing. Power at 50%, 30%, 0. Field completely collapsed. Silence. Long, empty silence broken only by the hiss of the tape. Then, quietly, almost lost in the background noise, a voice. Not one of the technicians. Not one of the observers. Someone else. Somewhere else. The voice was distorted, the pitch wrong, the timbre inhuman. It said, clearly and distinctly, "We are not alone in here." The tape ended. Henry played it again. And again. Each time that final phrase sent chills through him. We are not alone in here. Not I'm not alone. We, plural. As if multiple entities had been present in that impossible space the field had created. as if something had looked back at the humans who'd accidentally intruded into its domain. He had everything now. Witness testimony from Edward Ryan and Arthur Calloway, documents showing Project Rainbow's existence, physical evidence from the bunker, the tape recording, photographs of equipment and calculations. It was comprehensive, compelling, irrefutable. Henry spent 2 weeks writing the article, checked every fact, verified every detail, made sure his sources were protected and his evidence was documented. It was the best work he'd ever done. A complete investigation that revealed the truth about the Philadelphia experiment, proved it had been real, showed how the Navy had covered it up and continued the research in secret. He published it in December 1965, a mid-level investigative magazine, respected enough to have credibility, but not mainstream enough to face immediate pressure from government agencies. The article ran with photographs, transcripts, expert analysis from physicists who'd reviewed the equations. For 48 hours it existed. People read it, discussed it, shared it. Then the suppression began. Ending. The experiment never stopped. It started small. Social media posts about the article being flagged as misinformation, automated systems removing links, suspending accounts that shared it. Nothing dramatic, nothing that drew attention, just algorithmic suppression that made the story gradually harder to find. Then the sources began recanting. Edward Ryan's family issued a statement claiming Henry had fabricated the interview, that the medical documents were forgeries. They said Edward had never discussed the Philadelphia experiment, that Henry had taken advantage of an elderly man's failing memory. The Navy archivist who'd helped Henry access documents denied ever meeting him. Said the photograph of the embedded sailor was a known hoax that had been properly filed in the discredited materials section, not the declassified archives where Henry claimed to have found it. The magazine that published the article issued a retraction, claimed Henry had violated journalistic ethics, fabricated sources, misrepresented evidence. They terminated his relationship with the publication, removed the article from their website, sent legal notices to anyone who'd republished it. Henry's emails vanished. Not just the messages, the entire account. His cloud storage was empty. Backups he'd made to multiple servers all gone. Like someone had systematically erased every digital trace of his investigation. He tried to go back to the bunker, maybe retrieve more evidence, document the site more thoroughly, prove it existed. The entrance was sealed. Concrete poured into the stairwell, the steel door removed and replaced with a solid wall, like it had never been there at all. Arthur Calloway was gone. The cabin in Maine abandoned, records showing no one had lived there in decades, neighbours who'd never seen anyone. Henry had the recording, had notes, but increasingly he began to doubt his own memory. Had the conversation really happened? Had he really spent 6 hours talking to a survivor of the experiment? Or had he imagined it, constructed it from his own research and desperation? The tape recording developed technical problems, static distortion, sections becoming inaudible. Henry made copies, stored them separately, but each copy degraded faster than it should, like the magnetic field itself was unstable, refusing to hold the information. Within a month, Henry Lockwood's reputation was destroyed. The journalist who'd broken important stories about Operation Paperclip, who'd exposed government secrets, who'd always been meticulous about verification, was now a cautionary tale. The reporter who'd gone too far, fabricated a conspiracy, lost his credibility chasing shadows. Other publications stopped returning his calls. Sources who'd talked to him before declined to comment. The investigative journalism community, protective of its reputation, distanced itself from his work. Not through any organised campaign, just through the gradual consensus that Henry Lockwood had become unreliable. He tried to fight back, wrote follow-up articles detailing the suppression, documenting how his sources had been pressured to recant. But no one would publish them. Editors who'd worked with him for years politely declined, said they couldn't risk their publication's credibility on a story that couldn't be verified, from a journalist whose recent work had raised serious questions. Henry considered giving up, letting it go. Moving on to other stories, rebuilding his career on safer ground. But then the package arrived. No return address, no postmark, no tracking information. It simply appeared on his doorstep 2 weeks after his article had been fully suppressed. Inside was a Navy dog tag. Old, scorched at the edges, the metal partially melted in patterns that matched the scorch marks Henry had found on the Philadelphia pier. Engraved on it was a name, James T. Morrison, and below that a serial number, a rank, and a ship assignment. Henry checked the Navy records. James T. Morrison, enlisted 1942, served in the Atlantic Theatre, killed in action 1944 during an engagement in the Mediterranean. His body had been recovered and buried with full military honours at Arlington National Cemetery. But stamped on the back of the dog tag, barely legible through the damage, were 3 words and a date. Philadelphia Naval Yard, October 28, 1943. Henry held the tag in his hands and understood. This was from someone on the inside, someone who knew the truth, someone who wanted him to know that he hadn't been wrong, hadn't fabricated anything, hadn't imagined the investigation. The sailors from the USS Eldridge hadn't just disappeared during the experiment. They'd slipped out of time, out of reality, trapped in whatever dimension the electromagnetic field had opened. And the Navy hadn't been covering up a failed experiment. They'd been covering up a successful one. Because the experiment had worked. They'd created a field that could bend space and time. They'd proven that reality was thinner than anyone had believed, that there were other dimensions accessible through the right application of electromagnetic energy. They'd opened a door to something vast and incomprehensible, and they'd never figured out how to close it properly, never found a way to bring back all the men who'd been caught in that impossible space. Some of them were still out there, lost between dimensions, waiting for someone to figure out how to retrieve them. The experiment never stopped. It just went underground. Moved to classified facilities, hidden in budget lines that appeared under different names, staffed by scientists who signed agreements that made discussing their work a criminal offence. Somewhere, in a bunker whose location appears on no map, the research continues. Scientists and engineers working with equipment descended from those original coils and generators, trying to solve a problem that shouldn't exist, trying to understand what they'd accidentally discovered in October 1943, trying to bring home men who've been missing for 8 decades but might, in their own experience of time, have only been gone for minutes. Henry Lockwood kept the dog tag, never published another article about the Philadelphia experiment, never spoke about his investigation publicly again. He knew when to stop, knew when pushing further would accomplish nothing except his own disappearance, but he kept investigating privately, quietly, building a file that he stored in multiple secure locations with instructions that it should be released if anything happened to him. Documentation that couldn't be disappeared because it existed in too many places, known to too many people. And sometimes, late at night, he'd take out the dog tag and look at it. Think about James Morrison and the other sailors. Think about the man who'd stumbled into Betty's diner in 1955, looking like he'd stepped out of a time capsule, warning about men buried in the field. Think about Arthur Calloway's final words. The experiment never ended. They moved it underground. And he'd wonder if somewhere, in some classified facility beneath some unmarked building, the USS Eldridge was still there. Not the physical ship, which had been transferred to Greece and served for decades before being scrapped, but some echo of it, some ghost trapped in the electromagnetic field that had never fully collapsed, still flickering between dimensions, still waiting to come home. The Philadelphia experiment wasn't a myth, it wasn't a hoax, it wasn't mass hallucination or Cold War propaganda. It was a brilliant, terrible mistake that the United States Navy made in October 1943, and has been trying to fix ever since. A mistake that proved reality was malleable in ways that science had only theorized, that space and time could be bent, folded, torn, that there were other dimensions accessible through the right application of energy, that we were not alone in the universe, that there were things living in those other spaces, things that noticed when humans accidentally intruded into their domain, and the men who didn't return, they're still out there, somewhere in the spaces between what is and what could be, trapped in a moment that never quite ended, in a field that never quite collapsed, in a dimension that exists just beyond the edge of human perception, waiting for science to catch up to the accident that trapped them, waiting for someone to solve the equation that would bring them home, waiting to come back from a place that doesn't exist on any map, from a moment frozen in time, from an experiment that changed everything we thought we knew about reality itself. And somewhere, in a locked filing cabinet in a secure facility that officially doesn't exist, there's a report, updated annually, classified at levels beyond top secret. A report that details the Navy's ongoing efforts to retrieve personnel lost during electromagnetic field research, conducted in October 1943. The report is never 0 pages. Every year there's new information, new theories, new attempts, because every year, somewhere, the field activates. For seconds, maybe minutes, long enough for instruments to detect it, long enough for observers to catch glimpses of a ship that shouldn't be there, long enough for someone to hear voices calling from a dimension that mathematics says exists but human senses cannot perceive. The sailors are still trying to come home, and the Navy is still trying to bring them back. Because the experiment worked, it proved something incredible and terrible, and now we have to live with the consequences. We have to live knowing that reality is thinner than we believed, that there are doors we can open but might not be able to close, that the universe is stranger and more dangerous than we ever imagined, and we have to live knowing that somewhere, in the spaces between spaces, men are waiting. Men who disappeared in October 1943 and haven't aged a day because time doesn't work the same way in the dimension they're trapped in. Men who deserve to be remembered, who deserve to be real, who deserve to come home.